Welcome to the Homegrown podcast, a place where we share the truth about food and farming from our kitchen to yours. I'm your host, Liz Hazelmeyer, along with my husband, Joey.
Good afternoon.
And together we hope to educate, inspire, and equip you in your pursuit of true nourishment. Today's guest is Daniel Firth Griffith. Daniel is a hunter husbandman, a storyteller, and award-winning indie author of 4 books, including his newest book, Stagtine. He is the co-founder of the Tim Shell Wildland, a large-scale concentric rewilding project, and the Robina Institute. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thanks, guys. Liz, Joey, it's a blessing to be back with you.
Yes.
And for those that don't know or maybe haven't heard already, Daniel's been on the show before. And we're going to be discussing a lot today. At least I'm excited to talk about his book, Stagtine, that I have here with me, that I've read a significant portion of. I have not finished the whole thing. We talked about that beforehand. So, Scout's honor over here. But there's a lot of it that's just super deep. Highly recommend it. It is chock full of stories and just awesome learnings along the way through those stories. Super cool. He's an eloquent writer, and I'm excited to get into it. If there is more that you want to learn and hear from Daniel, some of his stories, some of how he got to where he is today, we'll probably get to some of that. I want to hear how he even came up with some of the concept of the book to kind of start today. But go back to that other episode. I can't remember the number of that episode.
Ooh, we'll look it up.
We'll look it up.
We'll
We'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
But go check that out to hear more of Daniel's story and kind of how he got to where he is today, because it's fascinating. We even share, wrestling kind of trauma, if you will. We both went through that in very different ways, but did nonetheless.
As I mentioned before we recorded, the overwhelming feedback after we released your first episode was that you, one, have the most eloquent voice people have ever. They're like, I want to listen to him. And 2, your storytelling ability is phenomenal. So it is one of my favorite episodes we've ever put out, and people adored it. And if you're one of the few that haven't listened to it yet, or you're newer to this podcast, please go back and listen.
Go check it out for sure.
But today we're talking about Stagtine, which I'm
Stagtine. Thank you for sending the book. Daniel, I wanted to jump in by hearing kind of the inspiration behind this book. So give people a quick once over to kind of catch them up to speed if they haven't listened to that first episode just yet, and then kind of leading into the inspiration behind this book.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks again. It's a blessing to hear that the previous episode was well received, and I'm really glad it got people thinking and talking and chatting and conversing. People like you and I write, you guys get to podcast more, but it's the same medium, to some large degree, and having that feedback is so absolutely marvelous and a blessing and a gift. So it's wonderful for me to hear. Yeah, the book, it's an interesting story, at least to me. I'll try to make it interesting to you all. My wife, listen to the other episode. You get a lot of story about how we got into agriculture. We started with permaculture, became regenerative farmers after a lot of health issues, as I think it is the modern story.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty common thread that runs through my story as well. I mean, my health problems were more or less uncommon, but it's a common thread that runs through it. But over the last maybe 8, 9, 10 years, we had started to experiment with certain aspects of what we early termed just letting go. A lot of agriculture, there's this dichotomy that we don't often speak about. But like industrial agriculture, it linearizes to control, and regenerative agriculture to a quite sizable degree diversifies to control. Okay, so industrial systems linearize to control, regenerative type systems diversify to control. We question the linearization, we question the reduction of nature into complicated systems, but we don't often question the control. The same result often is yielded to in the end, which is an industrial farmer might plant conventional, tillage-based, chemical, herbicide and pesticide-based corn. Right, so it's a linear system. It reduces all of nature's complexity for a singular product, right? And people like you and myself, people like maybe our listeners, we see that end product as not healthy for us. So the control in the industrial system is the end product of that control is a lack of health in the consumer, you and myself, in our own bodies. Regenerative agriculture, it's a much more nuanced subject, because the idea and the underlying philosophy of regenerative agriculture is to produce the opposite. Good food, right? Good outcomes. But the way in which we do so, we might, instead of looking at linearity, we might look at diversity, which to some degree is the opposite of linearity, to some degree, not the full degree. But we still have control. And so what in this book I wanted to get to, and this was the first idea for the book, is really examining I shouldn't say examine, really questioning what does that control yield in human systems? Okay, because you might think you're eating a grass-fed and finished steak and that it's really healthy for you, and it comes from a farm local to you that really cares about nutrient-dense foods, growing in nutrient-rich soils. Maybe, you're a body optimizer, you're into cryotherapy, and you're trying to get bioavailability in your food, like whatever it is. That's how we perceive it. But how it's actually completed behind the scenes on the farm, it's still based in control. So if control in an industrial system yields a lack of health, the question of the book is, does control in a regenerative system yield a lack of health? We had that thought maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and so we started letting go. And that's really the story of the emergence of the Wildland Project, or Timshel Wildland as it's known legally. We call it the Wildland Project more lovingly. But it's what it is. It's a project. If you stop castrating pigs, which every pig farmer alive castrates their pigs because it contains, if you don't, something called boar taint. It just makes the meat unpalatable. It smells rancid almost. And so, most pigs, if not all pigs, are castrated. So we started to question, what if you didn't castrate the pigs? What happens then? And I mean, that was some early questions early on. The book gets into some more recent questions, more present questions for our lives. But what happens when we start to lose that control? I mean, that's what we're looking at, not just for the animals, not just for the humans farming the system, but for the humans in our community participating and consuming the products from the system, the life from this system. And about 2 years ago, I was teaching a course on regenerative grazing, more or less, and I was completely underwhelmed by the lack of all of the students delivered a general lack of enthusiasm for the nuance of grazing. They were all very interested in learning how to better graze their cattle, in the sense that, do I move them once a day or twice a day? Do I raise this cattle breed or that cattle breed? It was very prescriptive. And again, I call back attention this idea of prescription back to a linear system that we can control. If I can prescribe you on how to have a happy marriage, it means that I know you, I can put you in a box, I can push you in a certain direction, put a mathematical function on top of you, and the end result is always going to be the same.
Yeah.
Well, like you guys know as much as my wife and I know, that's never going to be the case, right? Life is nuanced, it's complex. And so we often get these two aspects of our language very much confused, and that confusion leads to a true lack of health, in my opinion, especially from a farming or agriculture or food production perspective. You have complex and complicated. I think we talked about this in the last episode, but a high level, complicated systems are like cars. If I'm in my vehicle, we have a Jeep Wrangler, and I turn to the left, the steering wheel, the car goes left, and it's a very good thing that it does. What a weird world we would live in if it didn't go left. But it sometimes went left, so you never really knew, right? We would all stop driving cars because we would all be crashing. Nature is that way. It's not complicated as a car is complicated, it's complex. And because it's complex, you can't just prescribe a certain practice over that system, right, and control it to get to some result. And so if we all care about the result, that's just assumed. We care about healthy food. We care about nutrient-dense food. We care about climate. We care about biodiversity. We care about, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. However you come at this, you care about something there. So we can all agree that we care about the result. And so if I can't, in a modern technological way, linearize my way to get to that result, to control my way to that result, I'm going to do it via a different narrative, which is most often biodiversity, right? So for instance, a lot of nutrient-dense beef studies have tried to compare, done at Utah State University and Massachusetts and many other places. They try to compare the nutrient quality of the grass to the nutrient delivering quality to the human eating the animal that ate the grass. And so what they've decided is that the higher amount of grasses that animal had access to, so the higher amount of biodiversity in the field where that cow, let's say, was raised, the more nutrients that beef contains. And so if we want to get to that result, nutrient-dense beef, all we have to do is control the biodiversity. So as we started, thinking through these things, when I was teaching, over the last 7 years, when I was teaching that course 2 years ago, I started to realize that very few people, because we so entirely care about the end result, that is a better climate, nutrient-dense food, whatever it is, that we don't really care for the nuance. We don't really want to see nature as our relations, but just our resources to produce really good food for us. And so we linearize our view. We look, away from the nuance, and it just got me thinking. And then a couple other things happened in our life where somebody literally told me to write the book. And so I started, just putting thoughts down on paper. And originally it was going to be basically a book that just chronicled our transition from regenerative agriculture to what we called, at the time, just a loose version of rewilding. And then as I started writing, I started to see the importance of the intermingling between story and science. So in the book, in the intro, I write that story and science, they're not interposed from each other. Like I think so much we think that's true. Like if you, Joey, you were talking about Shakespeare earlier before we recorded, but like generally people who enjoy reading Shakespeare are not going to be people who love reading scientific papers. It's just true. You generally don't get that. And it's one of the reasons that people, I think they struggle to place my book on a shelf. All of the books I've ever written on shelves. And even in the intro, I acknowledge this. I mean, it can fit with, the Mabinogi, the Brothers Grimm's, tales of Russia and Eastern Europe and mythology type, Arthurian legends. But it could also fit next to Dr. Fred Provenza's book on, called Nourishment, which just undergoes the palate feedback loops and the rich science of the last 40 years of his life. And so it's a very creative understanding of interrelation between story and science. And the book started to emerge. And it started to emerge in many ways, looking at science and story, looking at the intermingling between these two things, but then also starting to realize that what I think we need now, we don't need increased abilities. I think we need to increase our humilities, or humility if you don't want to say it as, cliche. We started to realize that everything we knew was given to us by our relations. That is to say, we might have been, I might be writing about open grazing, which is a particular grazing practice that's described in the book. But we didn't come up with it, right? The cow named Patty came up with it, and a herd of cattle, developed it, and all we did was listen. And so the book morphed into something that it's both humbling, embarrassing, but also like wonderful, very comfortable at the same time. It's a weird emotion to have as the author looking at it from this perspective. What the book is really asking us to do is to stop controlling nature to get to a point, but rather pay attention to nature, give her a voice actually, and see where she goes. Stop trying to, look at the end goal and control our way to get there, but instead look at the end goal, wonder if that's Earth's end goal as well, forget that end goal, and then just allow all of life, all of our relations, our 2- and 4-legged cousins, our vegetative cousins, the slithering, the sliding, all of our relations to go in that direction together. And the most beautiful thing is, and this was handed to me, I'll tell you this and I'll stop rambling. The most beautiful thing is the outcome of this conversation. The conversation is, in the writing of the book, I got really stressed. We have 3 children. I care about their futures. And as Joey, as somebody who's read the book, you understand this. But one of the fundamental aspects or questions in this book is, what if we release the idea of outcomes, right? If we can't control our way to get to an outcome, what if we, instead of just challenging the control, what if we start to challenge the outcomes? If humility is what we need, not increased ability, that also means that the outcomes need to be, challenged. What if climate change, in other words, is not an emergency or a crisis, but just the climate, animate, a biological, not physical force retreating away in grief from the lack of attention we've paid her, for instance? Like, what if it is a literal animate object, like a tree is a literal animate object? It has life to it. That's one of the questions. And anyways, as you release that outcome, as a father, as somebody who cares about the food entering my children's stomach, as somebody who does a lot of the cooking at home, etc., like that's really stressful to release outcomes. Like for instance, this year, this past winter, we didn't really have a winter at all, and the tick pressure, the chigger pressure, the spider pressure, all in the landscape around us is exponentially higher. Just there was no kill period during the winter season, the non-growing cold season. And it's very welcoming as a father who basically lives outside with his three children, obviously with my wife Morgan. When there's ticks all over us, that like I can provide remedies. I have these tinctures, I have the homeopathics, I'm ready to go with these herbs in case Lyme disease or anything else presents itself. So it's very comforting to have a solution. And what the book is asking us to do in the modern world is to challenge our role as humans and ask, what if our vision of the world isn't the world's vision for itself? Right. And so it's kind of letting that idea of outcomes go, but it's very stressful to me.
Mm-hmm.
It was stressful when I was writing it. So I reached out to a friend of mine, a distant mentor. His name is Wahankape Topa, 4 Arrows, it translates. He's a sun dancer of the Lakota. I said, I said what I just said to you, and I'm going to get this quote wrong. It's in the very back of the book. It's in the epilogue. Maybe we can read it later if it matters, if I butcher it, but I can paraphrase for you now. And he says, Daniel, we have to release the hope, not in the understanding that hope doesn't exist, but rather, instead of placing hope in an outcome, place hope in the idea that Creator gave you life, this life, and all you have to do is walk in that journey. Whether or not there's an actual outcome at the end of it, as you see it, doesn't matter. But the fact that Creator or God gave you life, made a journey for you to walk on, just walk that journey. For good or ill, joy or grief, just walk it. That's what we have to be focused on. And he said, just be human. Like, what does humanity do nowadays? Be human, right? Just as we would not like to be told what to do, maybe we should be telling our animals less, what they should do. And then you have the rest of the nuance of the book. What does that really look like? And so that's how it started to be written. I will add this last part. I think I said I'll stop rambling, but I'll lie to you and just add this last part. Very early on, we realized that because of the nature of the way we were going to publish this book, but also write this book, and the very nature of the way that the book has really been to giving voice to our relations, not as resources for us to produce and sell and profit or solve climate change with, but just relations. True relations, not resources. That we also needed to surround the book's writing process with a community of relations, not just the land, but with humans. So during the writing process, very early on, we started meeting 2 times a week, 2 hours at a time, so 4 hours a week, with a group of people that we organized, all from different backgrounds, different perspectives, different worldviews, different religions, whatever it is. And every week, twice a week for 2 hours at a time, we would just sit down Tuesdays and Fridays and just hash these conversations out. And I will tell you, as the author, it's so special. It's such an honor for me to step back, deliver these books to the general readership, to our community. And it's not just my views of the thing, but it's questions that are arising in the world around us and in our own communities that we can start to open our eyes to together. Because at the end of the book, what I hope you get is that, whether or not you're a family trying to eat better, or you're in agriculture, or maybe you're a conservationist who doesn't like agriculture, this book is written for all of these different, people. I hope at the end of the book, you start to question, 1, what it really means to be human, which automatically, 2, necessitates that we tell a lot of other life forms around us a lot less what they should be doing, and start asking what would they like to have us start doing. And it's a co-creative crescendo where this whole thing converges into the one stream, which is the path that Creator or God put us on. And there and only there do I think we have hope. So the end of the story, I hope, is hopeful. Sometimes when you're reading it, especially because it really chronicles our transition from this isolationist type permaculture regenerative farm over to concentric rewilding landscape, which I guess we can talk about soon if you want. It doesn't hide our failures. The book a lot of the time is just me laying on the mudroom floor with my shirt off, caked in mud, just screaming at the ceiling because we're failing so completely. And so it goes through those points of hardship to find that piece of hope in the end. What does it really mean to be human?
That's so good. And thank you for that. And your rambling is very welcomed here, because we will also catch ourselves rambling very often. So I want to jump into some of the book here and kind of touch on some of the points you were already making. So forgive me if it feels like we're going backwards a little bit. But
no, please, you lead.
We're talking about control. We're talking about different forms of almost like quantifying a quantified or quantitative approach to something that maybe you're suggesting requires more of a qualitative approach, right? And we're seeing this in a story early on in the book. And I'm going to pose a story to you. You can kind of fill in the blanks of the story, but the real topic I want to jump into to better understand, one, just to get like a basic description, but then also kind of like the inner workings of what this means to us today, and maybe how we should approach it, is this idea of field harvesting. And so there's a scene in the book portrayed in a story, and the hunter in me is just locked in as we're talking about this. And it's a very moving story of you and Morgan out in the field. I'm guessing, I believe. Yes. And you're harvesting an animal, and there's a very personal connection you have. You know the name of the creature you're choosing. You're waiting until the right moment, till the bullet's going to be passing through the animal at the right, it's not going to be quartering away or in too much of a harsh angle. It's giving you the broadside, and there's no, like the backstop is going to be appropriate, right, to shoot. And it's deep, it's powerful, it's moving, and then we kind of get to a place where we're discussing field harvesting. So I'm gonna leave it there. Anything that I maybe missed that's critical, but I want to talk about field harvesting in general, what that is, what that means, and maybe what that means to you now.
Got it. Yeah, it's a good question. I'll say first and foremost, it's illegal. So if you're listening to this and you really enjoy it, call your senator or whatever. I mean, I'm not joking.
Yeah.
In the state of Virginia, you're allowed to process 20,000 chickens on your farm every year, totally uninspected. But you're not allowed to process one cow on your farm year over year. I recently keynoted the USDA's annual conference up in Washington, D.C. It was a weird thing for me to do. I dressed as I dress now. I don't know if you can see it, but there's covered in dirt where we raise and train draft horses for horse logging and such. And we have a mare about to foal, and I've been outside all day. But this is how it looked. It's just a weird thing for me to keynote the USDA's annual conference in D.C. First time I've been in Washington, D.C. for a decade or more. But I got to go out to eat with the chief scientist of the USDA following the presentation. And I will say that she didn't even know what I just told you, right? I mean, like the scientist at the USDA, the chief scientist at the USDA, that's her title. And if you're like, Daniel, what's her, that is her title. Her title is the chief scientist of USDA. And she asked me what I think farmers need for the Farm Bill. And I said, it's easy. We need to deregulate smallholder local food sales. I'm not saying deregulate large industry. I'm just saying we need to understand that if a farmer wants to sell meat to his neighbor, and I literally mean neighbor, I mean, we could be, joining property lines. I don't care how the law is written. We need to be able to move food locally, because the only food that we can move locally is food that we take 3 hours north first and then bring 3 hours back. This is not okay. And she was like, yeah, well, why can't you? And I was like, because you said I can't. She's like, that's just so interesting. I never would think that you can process 20,000 chickens on your farm unregulated with one cow. And I was like, well, there you go. So anyways, as I'm saying, if this is interesting, call your senator and start begging. But yeah, the field harvest, it's an interesting process because for the first time, the husbandman, the farmer, the agriculturalist, right? That's what husbandmen mean, husbandry, animal husbandry, really gets to become the hunter, right? So the standard idea of field harvesting is that you're just not doing it inside. You take the animal, you separate it from the herd, you put it into a head gate or a chute, if you will, so it can't move. Again, we're linearizing to control. This is industrial agriculture. So even most field harvests is just industrial. We'll keep coming back to this idea of linearizing to control. What we were interested years ago was hunting. Okay, so as the book details, we've really been able to, I don't want to say pioneer, but we've really been able to actualize the idea of truly letting herds of animals go and start to graze on their own, which, again, I'm going to repeat this phrase 10 times in this podcast, but if we want to talk about it in the future, we can. But the reality for us now in this moment is that it's really hard for us to get any animal into a head gate or loading chute, right? Because they're grazing 100 acres at a time. It's one herd. They're not castrated or weaned. So we have a 2-year-old bull that's technically a bull calf that's still nursing on its mom. And it's as big as the bull. I mean, he's 2,000 pounds, fine. He's maybe 1,500 pounds, very large animal. And so you have all these herd relationships, these maternal bonds still connected. And so if you try to separate a, sizable bull from its mom when it's still nursing and it's intact, meaning it's a bull, and you try to separate that from the herd and bring it into a chute, it's a very dangerous process. let alone days of work. And so we started to question whether or not we actually could facilitate a field harvest as a hunter would facilitate a field harvest. And so what we started to experiment with, and we have a whole facility on the farm here dedicated to the training of this. So we teach courses year over year for people who want to do this for themselves. Because in the United States, and especially here in the mid-Atlantic states, Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, etc., if you want a field harvest, you can, but you have to consume it yourself. So it's totally legal if you want to do it for yourself. And you own the land, and you own the animal, and you own the gun and everything else. And so we teach people how to do it themselves. And so we started to experiment. If a herd of animals, let's say their cattle are grazing 100 acres at a time, and it's just mountainous Virginia, Shenandoah Valley type, Blue Ridge Mountains, Cumberland Mountains, ecoregion, and it's just rolling and very complex. It's not just like a flat, Ohio or Indiana, plain, if you will. Well, I guess you guys are in Cincinnati, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what I remember? Okay, so you're getting there. You're getting to the Kentucky Hill. What if we at 5 a.m., 6 a.m. walk out there with a long distance rifle and harvest it at a couple 100 yards or 100 yards or something, so that the animal never even knew we were there? Maybe it said, "Oh, that's an interesting smell. Maybe Daniel's here to move us to the next, block in the wildland or something, or maybe he's just here to check on us." But you're never considering, the animal isn't, as far as we know, considering the idea of death. Okay, and if you read the book, as you have, Joey, you'll notice at the end of section 1, we talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
That, and I'll save that for another moment here in the podcast. But the idea of death is a very important concept in concentric rewilding. And so we started to experiment with long-range hunting type relationships where you go out there at 5, 6 a.m., you wait for hours, waiting for the herd to get into the right spot for the animal that you're trying to harvest to get away from, the herd of animals, just distance enough so that you have a backdrop. It's a safe shot. It's a shot that's going to kill the animal immediately. I'm not interested in harming an animal, right? We're trying to harvest the animal. And so you'll sit there waiting hours. And it's not unlike hunting in that way, right? I mean, we've even we call these things hunts. We've even had people join us to harvest our own meat still, of course, but they've joined us because they wanted to learn. And nothing happened. The bull never walked away from its mom. It never got into the right position. We felt literally this has happened spiritually. This happened with a cow named Essence. We went out hours waiting for the shot. My wife looked at me, Morgan, and she said, "Daniel, today's not our day. Like, something is not right about harvesting Essence today." So we didn't. And so there's a lot of nuance and complexity there. You're really allowing nature to speak a little bit more freely. You're also totally allowed to, and you have to be open to the idea that all of this work is for naught, right? Just when you go on a hunt. I've said this on a podcast before, but my godfather growing up used to take me hunting all the time. And he would always tell me, he said, "Daniel, it's called hunting, not getting."
Mm-hmm.
Right? When you go and you hunt, the probability of you actually getting, right, is very low. And that's not the point. The point is the hunt.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing has to be true for field harvesting, in my opinion. And so the story, it really dives into the book on this unbelievable situation. It's never happened before, and it's never happened again. It was truly a one-time moment that we've experienced where, after falling a bull named Lionel, which is a wonderful epic in and of itself. Right after you shoot it from a distance, you have to, it's brain dead. You've killed its central nervous system, and it falls and it looks dead, but it's not dead yet. Its heart is still pumping.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to come in with a large knife and you cut the 2 arteries and the veins in the neck, and you allow it to bleed out. And that really allows, one, the blood to leave, the body to relax, more or less, and its life source to truly actually evacuate. It's a wonderful process. And we were busy, as I say in the book, covered in the lake of blood, if I can remember, a lake of blood. And all of a sudden the herd, which is free range, we're in 100 acres, right? And it's one herd. We don't, like I said, castrate or wean, and we also don't separate boys from girls. And so it's just one massive herd of hundreds of head of bovine cattle, bulls, cows, heifers, calves, etc. And they just started to circle, and they ran around us 3 times. Like in the book, I mentioned that it was like, I'm sure we've all seen Lord of the Rings, but in the 2 towers, when Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas are in the Rohan area, and those horses like circle them, it was like that. It was like an old cavalry or an ancient cavalry circling around their prey, and they literally stampeded around us 3 times, and then they stopped. And I'll never forget, I looked over, and Morgan had literally crawled on top of Lionel's body, like she was on his stomach. Like we just we thought we were going to be ran over by hundreds of, bulls and such. And our cows, they're a mix between 3 breeds, all of which are very large horns. Like even in the picture behind you, like that's about the size of a small cow's horns. Like they're huge cows with huge horns. They come from Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Spain. And again, details, but the details are important. It was very scary. It was nerve-wracking. It was just not a place where a human wants to be in the middle of all of this. And anyways, they circle around us 3 times and then they stop. And I will never forget, I don't even know who the calf was. And we know a lot of our calves, son of Ellie, son of Nancy, whoever they are. I have no idea who this calf was, but it walked out, after the whole herd circled us and stopped, like forming a complete ring around us. This calf walked out into like the middle ground, like between the band of its brothers and its sisters and its families, these extended lineages that we can, really unpack when we understand concentric rewilding. And it stood in the middle ground between us and that band, that family unit that surrounded us. And I'll never forget, it looked right at me. And I'm like crying at this point. And by the way, when I'm reading the audiobook, which, I'll make sure I send to you after this, Joey, when I'm reading this in the audiobook, I started crying, and the editor of the audiobook kept it in the audiobook. So if you want to hear me cry, listen to the audiobook. And I'm crying in this moment, and I'm crying reading about this moment and writing this moment, and it bawled. It just said this very simple calf noise that I won't repeat for you now. But it just bawled at us just one time, like a moo, but a way a calf would say a moo. And then it just backed up and the herd dissipated. And it was this unbelievable, like even now I have goosebumps. Even now, I can still feel them dissipate, and like the energy went with it. And everything that I can remember calling up from the moment and just times spent for years later thinking about it, it was like this unbelievable middle ground messenger between life and death that we got to participate with, right? Like in what the moment here in the book is saying, and I'll repeat it here for us listeners, is it is not often that humans get to participate in the life process, right? We go to the store, we buy food, it's packaged. We go to the local supermarket where we can buy unpackaged food at the local food co-op, and it's unpackaged, but the point is it's still processed. It's there. Its life force is long gone. We never get to participate in that harvest where the life force is contained in the animal's body. And I kid you not, we've done hundreds and hundreds of field harvests since. Sheep, goats, pigs, cattle, doesn't matter. And there's a moment during that process, and I'm sure you've seen this with deer if you've been lucky enough to literally watch its spirit leave it. And I don't mean you can see it, but you see its body go and it sinks, and it's the last time, and it never rises again. But it also hasn't been rising and falling rhythmically like it's breathing. It just is there, static, right? So when you field harvest, like I said, you shoot it through the brain, and it brain kills it. It kills the central nervous system, so it stops breathing. You never get to see it breathe again. But after you slit its neck and you allow the lake of blood to fill all around you, and you're going through this harvest process, that in my opinion, every consumer who's ever eaten a piece of meat, you need to go through this process. I truly and honestly believe that to be there is to understand what the food truly means. And I don't want to sound crazy, but like, unless you are there crying, it's really hard for me to eat meat outside of that. And what I mean is you don't have to be there every time, but to experience the true glory, grief, glitter, joy that is life, death, and rebirth. The rebirth coming when you eat it, and that literal amino acid profile, calcium profile, life profile becomes a part of your own body, right? To truly understand it, you have to go through this process. I think it's an integral aspect of transitioning from a consumer to a participant in our food system. And when you go ahead.
No, as I had the point down of, hey, the importance of participating in the story of your food. I think how it was written in the book, and I was going to ask you, and you've explained it, I think, perfectly. But I do believe that many people need to have experienced the full story of their food. I also believe it's highly unlikely they will get the stampede that maybe you got. I have,
which is probably better, by the way, for liability reasons.
I would be quite disturbed if I was ever in the woods and I took a deer out and then there was, a stampede of deer around me. That would be quite strange. I would definitely be scared for sure. I would be trying to climb a tree or something.
Yeah.
But anyhow, I like that. I love that. I wanted to ask, right, because we're talking about field harvesting, and that was something I was going to bring up, right? So it's illegal. It's illegal to sell the meat that we field harvest. It's not like I can go.
Illegal. Yes,
It's
sir.
illegal to do that because I'm sure it goes against the protocols of safe, food safe handling that has been. I'm sure there's some reason why it was implemented, and there's probably
Right.
some good reasons why it's there.
Yeah.
And there's also some detriments to that decision. But if we were to explain field harvesting in a nutshell, right? The eloquent, like the hunting aspect of it, would we compare hunting separate from field harvesting to be a very similar thing? And where can hunting go wrong?
Yeah.
With this kind of, you see what I'm trying to get at? I'm trying to
Brilliant
make
question.
Yeah.
Brilliant question. I got to take that. There's a chapter in the book called Interlinkages. At the very end of it, I don't address it particularly, right? Because that's not a question that I wanted to raise in the book, but it's answered inevitably, your question, in this aspect of this chapter. So in the Interlinkages chapter, what we're really asking, the question central to that chapter is the memory of food transferable by the consumer of the food? Okay, and so if a unhappy cow is consumed by a human, is the human inheriting the unhappiness? And it's a weird question because you're going to think immediately like, what a woo-woo question that doesn't make any sense. This new age misses whatever it is, however you view it. But I challenge you, just really momentarily here. If I feed glyphosate to a cow, and let's say you don't like glyphosate, it's not something that you like to eat, a pesticide or herbicide. It's labeled as a pesticide. It's really an herbicide. Roundup, maybe it's more popularly known. And you were to eat that cow, as long as you ate an aspect of its meat, which contains blood, or if you drank its milk, you would inherit glyphosate. So chemicals, glyphosate, is inheritable when you consume that meat. Serotonin, oxytocin, cortisol, these are all chemicals that are contained in the mammary, i.e. the milk, just like glyphosate, but also in the blood cortisol, right? So when you eat the meat. And so the chemical is in the same way present in the meat when it's transferred to you as glyphosate is in the same way. And so the question of the chapter is, if glyphosate is inheritable to you when you consume the meat, is serotonin transferable to you when you eat the meat? That's the point of the chapter. At the end of the chapter, we conclude with an examination of this large study. I think it was 5,000 different hunts. So these are true hunts that a international team in the Dinaric region of the Croatian Alps, which they completed the study there, to be very clear, because the Dinaric, I don't know how you pronounce that, region of the Croatian Alps still has many of the apex predators still viably acting in that ecoregion. So for instance, I mean, we have wolves, we have bears, I mean, we have lynx, I mean, we have all of these species that have been eradicated from mainland Europe. And so they wanted to test it there because this region has prey species still continually being hunted by predator species, and not just predator species, but apex predator. And so in some degree, this is a very similar, or this ecoregion is in a very similar way as it has been historically. And so that's our question, right? The question is hunting good, or can hunting be done bad, or how is it comparable to field harvest or even USDA slaughter techniques, etc.? And the really interesting thing is, leading up to this part of the chapter, we're looking at USDA slaughter, we're looking at EU slaughter techniques, we're looking at halal and kosher slaughter rights, and we're trying to understand the blood cortisol volume's relationship to slaughter or harvest technique. That is to say, when an animal undergoes stress, you being an animal yourself, your adrenal system processes. When your adrenal system processes due to glucuroid, receptors and everything else, it produces cortisol. But that cortisol is what we call blood cortisol because it lives in your blood, and we can identify it there. I'm skipping a lot of the scientific mumbo jumbo, but I think that's enough of a picture. The interesting thing is you can take an animal with almost no blood cortisol, to note, have it undergo a slaughter process, either USDA, halal, kosher, EU, doesn't matter, and then measure that same blood cortisol volume post-mortem, so after the animal is dispatched, after it's harvested or slaughtered. And the interesting thing is, in all of these standardized rites, rituals, techniques, whatever you want to call them, the blood cortisol is through the roof. Interesting aside, which could be an entire podcast by itself, I realize. But the reason this matters is this. With an increase in blood cortisol, you see an increase in meat pH. An increase in meat pH equals a decrease in shelf life, a decrease in meat tenderness, a decrease in meat's ability to fight off bacterial growth in things, right? So it's much better for human consumption if it's not high pH or high blood cortisol. The interesting thing is with high blood cortisol, with high meat pH, we also see a decrease in what's called those nutrients ability to undergo what's called the lipid phase or the liquid phase. I apologize. Read the book; it's there and it's accurate. It's been peer reviewed. But the point is, as you progress through that lipid phase, it actually becomes bioavailable. I'm sorry, it actually decreases in its bioavailability to human consumption or for human consumption. And so the point is, you can take an animal that's grazed the richest, most biodiverse, most nutrient-rich pasture seen on Earth. This is the most regenerative of regenerative farms. But if that animal goes into a stress response during slaughter, which is a 100% chance, looking at about maybe 7 to 10 different studies internationally completed over the last 40 years. That's what the study looks at, right? So if it experiences stress during that slaughter process, which is about 100% chance over the last 40 years of scientific research, there will be a decrease, and a significant decrease in the overall bioavailability of those nutrients when you consume it. So let's say you had 10 nutrients before, it's going to have 1 or 2 nutrients after. And so you could be spending $16 a pound for the best regenerative, most grass-fed and finished, most nutrient-dense food on the planet. But if it's experienced stress, you're getting 1 or 2 of those 10 nutrients. And so we see a significant decrease in the bioavailability. So when I was writing this chapter and learning these things and talking with a lot of scientists around these studies, I wanted to know, is this just death, right? Because that's a question we have to ask. You're listening to this and you say, Daniel, like, death is stressful. This is just something we have to understand and accept. And so when I was reading about this study about 5,000 roe deer, red deer, and wild boar, so these are all prey species in the Dinaric region of Croatia, high up in the Alps, they studied 2 different techniques of hunting, and then about 10-ish nuanced variables underneath that, age, size, gender, etc. But the 2 different hunting techniques that they looked at, the first of which is called drive hunts, and the second of which they called select hunts. So just to use modern terminology, a drive hunt is a hunt where the deer is being chased, or the boar is being chased by dogs, by humans. If you've ever been hunting and one person sits on top of like a naked bowl, a mound of a hill where you can see all around you, another person is running through a wooded valley to kind of jump the deer out of the valley so they can shoot him in the field. This is a hunting technique that I've experienced a lot in Ohio and West Virginia and Kentucky.
It's common. No, it's common. Yeah. As a hunter, I read this, I was eating it up, and you see it a lot with, especially if people are hunting. There's also a lot of dispute of drive animals being legal or not.
Yes. In Virginia, they're completely legal.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And there's also the people really dislike it when they watch people drive like mountain lions, because there is mountain lion hunting, and there's a lot of that going into play as well. And I'm going to get into some predator talk here in a little bit, but continue.
Yeah, no problem. I look forward to that part. I'll talk predators all day with you. So the first way is called a drive hunt, which is what you're describing, Joey. The idea that you're pushing the animals into a kill zone and then you kill them. The other side is a select hunt. Now, you're still using weapons or modern technology. Sometimes they did study people with bows, but the point is still that the animal is being stalked. You're walking in the woods as if you were an animal, and you're moving back and forth, and there's rhythm, and there's liquid, and there's really... It's really high not in the skill of the hunt or even the art of the hunt, but the oneness of the hunt, meaning that the animal doesn't even see you as the threat. You're moving. That's the idea, hopefully, if you do it right. So you're moving through the woods like an animal will move through the woods. And so they studied these 2 different main aspects, and then, like I said, about 10 tertiary or secondary nuanced smaller variables or aspects: size, gender, age, etc. And they found that a drive hunted but wild harvested, if we can call it that, right? So a drive hunted but wild harvested deer, either red or roe deer, and boar had almost exactly the blood cortisol volume of a dispatched in the USDA system processed cow. Almost identical characteristics. The select hunted deer, so the deer that are being hunted from a much more, like I said, relationally intense, but much more an indigenous perspective, meaning that we're in the system, we're in life, we are earthlings together, and it just so happens that today you were my food, maybe tomorrow I'll be yours. It's much more of that mutual respect. That system I mean, had almost no blood cortisol to name. And then to double check that finding, again, after, thousands, I think it was 5,000 different roe and red deer and wild boar studied, they then surveyed in the same region of Croatia, red and roe deer raised in farms, dispatched in, EU maybe processing facilities. I don't know what Croatia uses for standardized, federally, mandated processing. But they studied the same species in a farmed environment that were being slaughtered. And again, double check the results in that if you are drive hunted or farm raised and, conventionally dispatched or slaughtered, you have the same blood cortisol, which not only one from an animal husbandry perspective decreases the overall palatability of the food. So as a farmer, I'm giving my consumers less tasty food. From an animal welfare perspective, right? This is easy, right? Stressed out animals that are almost, I didn't mention this in the book, we talk about it, but they're almost diabetic coming out of the system. Not just maybe is their life producing a diabetic animal with beef marbling or fat marbling and other things, but the slaughter process is so adrenally intense that we are absolutely shutting down major functions in their body right before they're passed. And I talk about in the book that 4 million, I think it is, people die every year of diabetes. I think just in the United States. Again, we can fact check if we can read the book. But the point being, what if, and this is the question, what if the way we treat animals, so animal welfare, through the slaughter process, when it really should be a select, hunted, field harvested animal, right, is one of the leading causes of modern obesity, modern suicide, modern diabetes, modern health epidemics. And it's not the way we raise these animals. Because, and this is the part where, there's a lot of people in the regenerative ag space that don't like this book. And so if you're in the regenerative ag space and you're listening to this, like I'm speaking to you, how we raise an animal matters. But what I'm here telling you and what all these scientists are telling you and what all of these indigenous leaders are telling you, and I'm just the medium of the exchange, really, because I've never studied the blood cortisol volume of a field harvested animal, although we field harvested our own animals. And many of them, and we teach courses on it. So we've been around it, but we've never studied it. So what all of these people are telling you, scientists and indigenous people alike, what they're telling you is that the way an animal is raised is only half of the story. The final moments of that animal's life, the final seconds of that animal's life, in terms of nutrient-dense beef and bioavailability of the nutrients for the consumer, et cetera, let alone the animal welfare value, which to me I think should be said first, is of unbelievable importance. Unbelievable importance. And so what I say to people is this, because you have plenty of questions, I'll answer them, but to speak to the consumer now, this is hard and it's really unattainable. And if I was listening to this as a consumer who's trying to feed my family better meat, and I'm listening to this idea of bioavailability being reduced in the slaughter system, but you're telling me that that slaughter system is the only system I'm legally allowed to buy meat from, I'm a little bit depressed, right? And now we go back to Hankari Topa, the Lakota friend and mentor of mine, on just be human. But the question, because that doesn't help anybody, just be human. It doesn't answer anybody's question. But I ask yourself that. What does being human in this moment mean to you? Because find a local farmer, right? Like start working locally. Start building, like we can't do this alone, right? Because I stand in front of the chief scientist of the USDA, like I told you, and it's interesting. But if 100,000 of us were to stand in front of the chief scientist of the USDA, it would become very much more interesting. So participate. I heard recently that attention is a moral act. I love that. You can't have these feelings. You can't have this overwhelming sense of depression brought on to you by the modern industrial conventional system that looks like regenerative agriculture and then not pay attention to it, right? To not give it attention, to not see it and start participating with it. That's what we need. We need participation. And it's going to evolve slowly. Nutrient-dense beef, grass-fed and finished beef in the USDA slaughter system is exponentially better than anything else you can buy. Start there. But don't stop there, right? Join this idea. Start, writing these letters. Find these local farmers. Start empowering them. Together, we can do this, right? So this I don't want it to be depressing because I was there and,
Totally. Everybody's real
healthy
food journey, right? We're all in different spots. We're all
That's
in different places on that timeline. I wanted to bring up, because I remember in the book, you mentioned even the method in which the animal was dispatched having little to no impact on the cortisol levels in the studies that were shown. And I just wanted to touch on that really quickly, because as a hunter and other hunters maybe listening, it was very fascinating for me to consider the idea that, man, it didn't really have as much to do with how quickly they died, which is actually really fascinating because this is
Yeah.
something in the hunting community that's really thought through. Elizabeth and I, we talk about this all the time as a hunter. If you don't know this by now, I mean, where have you been? But I hunt very regularly. It's something that's very important to me. It's very, it's a legacy thing, but it's also a provisional thing. And I would say even further, you were saying, hey, there is hope, but not just that, like, you could, like, hunting is an option, and one that I would promote. And it's not as easy as it sounds, right? It's not like you can just go out, and it's why it's called hunting. We talked about this, right? It's not getting, it's hunting. You will find yourselves many a days cold with nothing at the end of your hunt, and that
Many
is
a weeks.
many
Let's
a
be clear.
and
your wife will be home with the children, and she will love you either way.
But the thought was, in the hunting community, that when you shoot an animal, if it takes, the faster it dies, then the less stressed it is, and the better the meat will be as a result. And so oftentimes, as a bow hunter, I hunt with a bow. I like using sharp sticks to kill animals, and I think that there's something about it that's the spot and stalk, the select hunt that you're referring to. The challenge of it is so much greater. And the intimacy I have of that story is totally different. And I don't know that it's the most convenient, especially if you're looking to dispatch a cow in the head. I don't know that it's a great option, just from like a logistical point of view. But I'm very pro. You mentioned it in the book, even, like, hey, instead of the arrow fling, we're talking about a trigger pull. But anyways, I'm getting lost here.
What about the fact that, like, when you're archery hunting, you have to be so much closer to the animal, and what if they do see you?
Then they spook and they run, and then you don't get your.
And you just have to be choosy with your hunt, like when you pull the trigger, basically, because you have a trigger on it.
Yeah, you release. There is, in bow hunting, right? When you're archery hunting, you are very limited, and yes, you have to be tactical in your spot and stalk, in your camouflage, in your blind, wherever you're hiding, or however you're, like moose hunting, you spot and stalk, right? You're not just sitting and waiting. And oftentimes with deer, you're sitting and waiting, and you find, where do they typically go through, and you're going to set up nearby in a way that they won't smell you, hear you, or see you. Because if they smell you, hear you, or see you, you are now identified as a threat. Because in the wild, and I want to get to some of the wildness and stress level kind of comparisons here soon, but they'll run away. So anyhow, I thought it was very fascinating that in the studies, if there's anything else you want to speak on to that the method in which the animals were dispatched had less of an impact, if not none, versus the pressing of the deer, the stressing of the deer. And is there anything else there? Because I want to get to the predatory approach.
Yeah, well, no, I'll make a quick note. What we found is exactly what you're saying. So the time in which it takes for the animal to finally die, between the shot, whatever that is, and its ultimate death, when its spirit leaves its body, scientifically has no ramifications in these studies. Scientifically, studying blood cortisol. That is not to say that who cares how long it takes for an animal to die, right? So I know you're not saying that, but I wanted to say it just to make sure that was clear. The other thing that I wanted to make sure in the chapter that was really well discussed and thought through was the animal husbandry before. So one thing that could be argued is hunting is better because the animal is more free throughout its life. And so regardless of how it dies, it's going to be better at processing in its adrenal system and its blood cortisol and everything else during its death, right? And the same would go for the conversation about animals. So one of the studies we looked at compared USDA slaughter techniques in view of post-mortem blood cortisol installation of the muscle fibers between factory-raised pork and woodland-raised pork, so pigs. Because you would think that the way in which you are raising the animal is going to affect its ability at the end of its life to regulate its blood cortisol volume, its adrenal system, right? And this really needs to be considered and questioned, because you can be listening to this episode and saying, no, I raise my pigs outside. They have very little stress. We've all heard people in agriculture say, we got to maximize and optimize the pigness of the pig and everything else. Scientifically, and I'm only speaking scientifically here, it is a very creative and imaginative science. I get it, but it's still scientific. It has no ramifications on the blood cortisol post-mortem in the muscle fibers. None. You can raise pigs indoors, you can raise them outdoors. You can raise happy pigs, you can raise sad pigs. But the point is that the slaughter technique, the dispatch method, the lack of autonomous interaction of relationship in the final moments of death, which might be called a wild harvest, doesn't change it. It's a leveling force. So you can raise pigs happily in the woods, but if they're slaughtered unhappily, you're still limiting the bioavailability of the nutrients. And I'm, again, only speaking about nutrients. We could talk about animal welfare and everything else. I'm just obviously not focusing on that in this minute. So that also has to be considered, right? And so the reason that matters is, and we can get into predators here in a moment, the reason that matters is it really starts to build the understanding of what rewilding or the wild, or what I would call concentric rewilding, is all about. So many of us perceive the wild and the mission of rewilding as something that's over there, beyond that fence, over that hedge, where the humans aren't, etc. I make a comment in the book that many rewilding projects begin as moving companies. They come in, they move all of the invasive life out, they move all of the native life back in, and then there's this meme that I always bring up. We had an internal phone call today with the team, the writing community that participated with the book, because we're now writing, we're finishing book 2, Cliffhawk, in the trilogy. And I brought up this meme. I bring it up all the time, but there's these 2 stick figures, and one of the stick figures is laying down, and the other stick figure has a stick in its hand, and it seems to be like the leg or arm of the laying down stick figure, and he's poking. The standing stick figure is poking the laying down stick figure, saying like, move, do something. And it's just like this pointless little meme about, but the point is it's rewilding in some large degree is that, okay? It's poking the wild, being like, go do something. We're going to leave. We're going to construct a 10-foot tall game fence around you. And it's the idea that we move life out of the system that makes it wild, right? So we take out all the domestic life and we leave the wildlife, and we call it rewilding. We look at ourselves and we tell ourselves that it's very successful and all of these things. Well, in the book, I talk about how humans are to Neanderthals like poodles are to wolves. Like, we are a domesticated animal, right? And we are domesticating by the moment. And if you just study the last, couple thousand years of human physical evolution, and what I mean by that is body stature, pelvic inlet depth sizes, so the female's birth canal size. Like, if you just look at these little things, domestication is not treating humans well. And so humans are not allowed in rewilding projects, right? And so what we're saying with concentric rewilding, and it gets back to this harvest and slaughter technique being the universal leveling force. Husbandry doesn't matter if the slaughter isn't cared for. It gets to the definition of what we call wildness. And the book sees it as thus. It defines wildness or concentric rewilding as the autonomous acceptance of the basic conditions as they are. Okay, and the one way we can unpack this, and the rest of the book unpacks it, the rest of the trilogy unpacks it. Cliffhawk, the next book, it's maybe 1.52 times the size of Stagtine as it sits now, but it dives into this piece by piece by piece by piece. What does it mean to autonomously accept the basic conditions as they are? But what you're describing, Joey, answering your question, Liz, about archery or bow hunting, to autonomously accept the basic conditions as they are is to hunt with a bow and not get anything. It's that acceptance that the basic conditions around you didn't give you the meat today. In the same sense that when you're field harvesting under our protocol, the concentric rewilding protocol, you might leave without beef. Like, who in the world goes to harvest a cow for beef and then doesn't actually harvest the cow, right? That's ridiculous. It's a whole new paradigm. I wish it was a perfect paradigm, right? I wish these animals could be free-ranging like deer. Obviously, we have property boundaries. We have other things we have to work through before that's going to be the case. Communities of people, tribes of people working together again. We're not there yet. But to as far as we can go with property boundaries, right, is in very similar way as hunting in this understanding of wildness. And so as much as wildness, as the definition says, autonomous acceptance of the basic conditions as they are, that's what I mean when I say wildness. As far as wildness exists in the harvest system, so also does not exist in equal proportion blood cortisol, diabetes, ketoacidosis, all of the other things that come from, basically high stress in animals. And so the degree of wildness is equal to the degree of health and bioavailability of that health to the consumer, as long as we understand wildness not as the exclusion of life or the moving of life, right? Like, if you want to rewild beavers, just go buy beavers, put them in a stream, buy the stream. You have to own the stream now too, and you've rewilded beavers. Like, good job. That's not what I mean by wildness, of course. We're not a moving company. We grow wild together. That's what the book is discussing. And as we grow wild together, we see blood cortisol going down. And so me being in the field with these animals, and I write about this in that chapter you discussed, the story, there's a little aside, and we put the little aside in there that has nothing to do with the story so that we can illustrate this fact. I don't know if you caught it. But we walk amongst our herds of animals. So the cattle, they're open grazing, let's say 100 acres, there's about 100, 150 of them. I always have a stick with me.
Mm-hmm.
And the stick is to mimic the weapon in my hand, so that when I'm there with a weapon in my hand, they do not see the difference. They recognize me as the individual who comes, looks at them, marvels at their beauty, and then leaves. That's how they know me, the human, Daniel Firth Griffith. And I carry a stick with me for that, for that point. And so as long as we can allow the autonomous acceptance of the basic conditions, life, right? And you see that in deer when they're walking around the forest, they're not being like, oh, daggone it. I wish there was more oak trees for me to nibble on, right? They just keep walking. They just accept the basic conditions as they are, and they just keep moving forward. There's a spirit that doesn't differentiate between grief and joy, right? That's really what that means too. It's patience, it's participation, it's attention, it's gifts, right? That's what we're talking about here. Slaughter, which is reason it's the interlinkages of chemicals from life to other life, from the cow to the consumer of that beef, is the first chapter, is because of that. It's really to introduce us to the concept of the wild, not as a thing that exists outside of humanity, but that includes all of us, all of our relations, which obviously includes ourselves.
That's so good. And one last thing before I ask Elizabeth if she wants to interject any questions she maybe has welling up before I continue to ask questions. But the one thought that went through my brain, again, as a I would call it, as a skeptic, but also one that wants to learn. So don't hear me saying that I don't believe. I'm curious. I was thinking through the statement and help me say it better. It was an article you had written at some point, and you were referencing it as nature being the best nutritionists, or something along those lines. I can't remember exactly how you worded it. I apologize.
No, it's good enough.
I didn't write that part down, but you were talking about the plants and how they know how to grow, like where to go, and the animals that they find it, and they're passing over. A bovine might pass by 50 different plants to find the one that it needs,
right?
And how that's just natural. And I felt like that's really powerful. It makes a lot of sense to me. At the same time, we're talking about the best way to dispatch an animal, and how the chase. There are some predators that when they take down an animal, it is exactly how I might do it when I hunt in the woods, and that would be like a mountain lion. Mountain lion, the deer doesn't even know. And next thing you know, it's on the ground and it's over. It's done. And it might not be dead right in this moment, but the dispatching has begun, and the animal is going to die very quickly. There are some predators that do not hunt that way, and those would be wolves. Wolves do not hunt that way.
Right.
Wolves are that this is how we as humans learned these different methods, right? So humans didn't just learn how to do a deer drive, or an animal drive of some form, which is very common. I know about this. And there's so many different ways to do it.
Right.
And Daniel mentioned a number of them. It's not just I have a hound dog that smells this creature and we chase it until it's too tired.
Right.
Humans have done this. Humans have chased animals and cornered them and dispatched them. That has happened. Also, you can, like you said, you go to a basin with a field at a high point, and you have 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 50 people that walk through a woods and kick deer out into the open.
Right.
Well, wolves do this, right? Now, maybe not as sophisticated as humans do, but pretty sophisticated. Wolves are very smart, and they will track down caribou, deer, moose in packs, and they'll chase them for a long time. And quite frankly, the end typically happens for these animals with wolves when that animal can run no longer, or finds themselves in a place where they can't escape. And I was just curious, any thoughts to that in regards to kind of how animals are able to know this, and I don't know, just that was how I was going to leave it.
Yeah, I'm smiling ear to ear if you're listening to this on audio. It's an amazing question. Amazing question. I'm so glad you bring it up. If we close ourselves off to the nuance that surrounds us, right, I think we can easily look at the words that I'm saying, listen to the way that they convey meaning, and we believe that nature, in its way, without human control, let's say nature before humans were here, in mass or something like this, when there was just significantly less of us on this continent. For instance, there wasn't, hundreds of millions. It all processed in this way, like you're saying, quick kills, no anticipation, etc. That's obviously not true, as you so well described. Wolves are a great example. the nuance. So that's if we close ourselves off. I think we get locked in this very non-nuanced, very closed box that nature exists in one way and one way only. Right, and that's definitely not what I'm saying. And I'm smiling because you give me the opportunity to really be clear and to speak about this nuance. It's interesting. The Lakota. So the horse is one of the most ancient grazers here in the Western Hemisphere. The horse was more or less eradicated for this and that reason many thousands of years ago, and they weren't brought back into the middle of the 1500s, early 16th century by the Spanish. And so before the horse was brought back to the Great Plains, the Lakota, the Sioux, the Cree, there's a number of different tribes that all have an oral mythology where they would hunt a wolf, don the wolf's clothing, and then crawl into a herd of bison as wolves on all fours, just so that they can get so close to the bison that they can spear it through its belly with their hands, the spears in their hands, not throw them, but in their hands, right? And so this image that we have of hunter-gatherer peoples, indigenous peoples long lived in the Western Hemisphere on the Great Plains hunting bison. They don the wolf's clothing to get so close to the bison that they can kill them with their hands, with spears underneath their bellies. So this image, in my opinion, totally deconstructs our very colonial, very civilized, very Western-minded interpretation of predators and prey in nature. Okay, and that worldview that we come with, in the book I say this is the rubble in our pockets. When we got here, the rubble in our pockets was this worldview that that nature acts competitively, that the wolf or the mountain lion, right? It of all things, I heard this on a Joe Rogan podcast recently, so I got to give him the credit. But he was saying that humanity is the only one that always wants to progress, right? Like you don't see a bunch of wolves getting around at the end of their season looking at their P&L being like, daggone it, we only harvested 34 caribou this year. Next year we got to at least get 40. Our goal was 40, damn it. That's obviously not what's going on, right? They're harvesting to eat. And so there's this co-creative, wonderful, I'm not saying it's not painful. Don't take that from my words, but there's a co-creative energy working between prey and predator to dispatch life, to intake life, to allow that life to be reborn inside of the predator's body, to then cycle through the nutrients, process and everything else over long epochs of time, so that life is always cycling. Now, I'm not saying that there's, reincarnation and everything else. What I'm saying is that the energy of life is always cycling between bodies. Whether or not it's in a compost pile, between your avocado, pits and the nematodes and bacteria and fungi in the pile, or if it's a deer in a field consumed by a wolf, or elk in a field in the north consumed by a gray wolf. So number one, we have to automatically understand that nuance exists, linearity does not, right? So this idea, going back to the very first thing that the podcast started on. And as long as we understand that, we get to look back to the science, looking through this very creative, very open, very wild worldview that I'm constructing. That's also a very ancient indigenous worldview that I'm inheriting. And all of a sudden, we get to see through the science that the time in which it takes for the animal to perceive the threat and defend itself from the threat, that is to say, by the time it sees you with its arrow in its body to the time it dies, does not matter from a blood cortisol volume perspective. Okay. And so to me, this is an instance where we get to understand, we get to have this little touch point into a natural ecological function where it doesn't matter if it's a mountain lion dispatching the head immediately, or a wolf pack hunting, charging, and chasing the animal for a long period of time. That doesn't matter. But what I want to focus on, okay, is this nuance not often discussed, which is the ability to defend itself. When a cow is in a trailer loaded through a loading chute, it can't go left, it can't go right, it can only go forward, it can't go backwards. It has no defense of itself.
Interesting.
Right? And so its anticipation of death, right, is like a human in front of a guillotine, right, in 1800s France. That is what it is, right? And so it's very stressful, it's very linear, it's very progressive, meaning that every step I take closer to the guillotine only further guarantees me being there, but I'm still guaranteed in being there. I can't get out. If I take a wolf and I chase a deer, or I take a wolf and I chase a bike and an elk, a caribou, whatever it is, that caribou sometimes wins, which is why it knows how to run. If every caribou that ever was chased, or every elk that was chased by a wolf or a mountain lion would die, they would never know how to run. But they do, indicating that they have. And maybe it wasn't them because they might be young, but their lineage, their genetic memory has this as an understanding. And so the key to focus on is if we have the ability to dispatch an animal quickly, to alleviate its suffering, we take that ability. I think everybody agrees with this. However, that is not to say that the system is linear, it's industrialized, it's reductionist, it's complicated, meaning that we can prescribe it to be perfectly in place, and we have to allow the nuance to exist. I have field harvested a cow where the bullet didn't strike the brain correctly, and it took me about 2 to 3 seconds to place another bullet in the right place to drop it, right? And I want to believe that that is the difference between seeing the wolf before it attacks or seeing the mountain lion before it attacks and the actual attack. We can't be perfect. Nature isn't perfect in regard to the time it takes for them to dispatch an animal, them being the predator, the animal being the prey, right? And so that's why it's so cool that the Dinaric study in Croatia did not conclude that timing matters, right? Because that would speak against the nuance of life. And it didn't, right? The timing doesn't matter. It's the autonomous ability to run away, the autonomous ability to not have a linear outcome at the end of this relationship. If every single time you went hunting, you killed something, now we are denuding life. Now we are reducing its autonomous ability to defend itself, etc. And the same thing goes, and I don't know if we want the conversation to go this way, but I'll bring it up and you can jump on it or not. But the same goes with plants. So a lot of the health-giving benefits of nutrient-dense beef don't come from primary compounds like zinc, primary or macro microminerals type zinc, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and other things. It comes from a secondary group of compounds called phytochemicals. Phytochemical in a plant's physiography are defense mechanisms. So when a plant doesn't want to be defoliated by an herbivore, it'll produce a certain phytochemical that limits the palatability or digestibility of its fiber, of its cellulose inside of that animal's rumen. Okay, so for instance, Sericea lespedeza, it's a legume that grows here in this area of the world, and when it gets stressed, it produces a phytochemical called a tannin. A tannin, by the way, you can extract and use to tan leather. That's what tanning comes from. If you have tanned leather, it's tannins. It comes from plants like Sericea lespedeza. I wouldn't use Sericea lespedeza to make a tanning liquor, but the point is it contains it, and it limits its palatability. And so that's its defense mechanism. And so when we're hyper-grazing cattle, right, in a pasture, let's say, and we're mobbing, we're mowing, we're moving, we're doing the regenerative thing, what we're doing is we're forcing the animals to eat plants that are defending itself because we want a total uniform graze. If you're listening to this and you're agricultural, you know what I'm talking about. If you're listening to this, you're not agricultural, trust me, this is what every regenerative farmer wants, is a tight, mobbing herd of herbivores to uniformly graze and distribute the manure across the soil surface. That's what we want to be regenerative. But what we're doing is we're forcing animals to eat everything. Even the plants that are phytochemically producing tannins, endophytes, saponins, etc., to defend themselves, to reduce their palatability because they're not ready to die yet. But because we already have the outcome in our head, just like a USDA slaughter system, right? Because we've reduced that life form's ability to defend itself, because we already have the outcome in mind, and we're going to control the system till it gets to that outcome, right? What we have are animals that actually can't keep up body weight in the pasture. They're not happy. They are stressed. They have tons of forage, but they're still stressed and they're still starving, right? Just like you would be stressed or still starving in the modern slaughter technique, looking at blood cortisol and the bioavailability that, is inversely related. Does that make sense?
It makes so much sense. I love that. Thank you. And I wasn't trying to be, I was just curious because these are some of the thoughts that are going through my head. I was like, man,
pick on it.
I'm telling you, I know these things in my brain, but I'm thinking like there is some natural kind of like, kind of history here.
Yeah.
Anyhow,
well, think about it. Put yourself in the cow's situation or the deer. You are being hunted. Okay. What if you absolutely knew the outcome was you were going to die? I mean, you're going to be in a different headspace and probably chemically and emotionally different than if you are like the deer getting chased by the wolf. And I think that piece alone, we can all, I'm like, why is Hunger Games coming in my head? I don't know. But, the Katniss hope that we can survive. I don't know. There's a piece of it that's like, you can understand as a human, none of us want to be hunted, but
yeah, even not as a scientist, just intuitively as a human. I agree with you.
Yeah. And so it makes sense to me that, while you could argue, well, there's like a lot of violence and stalking and pressure and stress in nature, but it's different because it's an open world and it's an open outcome. The outcome is not defined. And that's how you have summarized all these pieces versus what we do in animal agriculture, which is not only have we defined the outcome, but we've defined every single moment of that animal's life, including the type of forage it gets to consume on a daily basis. And I have heard these conflicting arguments of like, well, we need to graze in tight pasture so that we can have the beautiful paddocks that look like they've been grazed and then they regrow, and it's just like it's very systemic. But then I've also heard the argument, which is what you're saying, of hey, but what about the there's a spider on the floor, you might want to squish that or let it be. Anyways, it was gonna crawl up his foot.
Crisis averted.
That spider didn't know it was about to die, but it just died, okay? And it wasn't stressed. I'm going to tell you right now. Anyways,
I was stressed.
Instant death. Talking about being hunted. The other argument of having wide open pasture and letting cows graze, what you're saying, 100 acres, and having them have the ability to self-select exactly what they're going to grow. Yeah, it probably doesn't fit in your nice little cute box like you wanted it to.
Right.
Which makes it hard. And so I love the concepts you're bringing up. For me, in my brain, I continue to go back to, which is probably so frustrating to you, Daniel, so I apologize, but I continue to go back to how can we apply this to a consumer? Like in my head, I'm like, okay, can we create these like long range grazing pastures where we shoot the animal and then we move the carcass and we can process it so that we keep the sacredness of death wild, but then we can also mass produce. Is that possible? I don't even know.
That's a good question.
I'm just always trying to like think through how we can get closer to it and still live in a modern society. I don't know if that's even possible. I don't even know if that's the goal. So that's my only thought.
It's a good question. I'm taking some notes because I want to address both aspects of your question, and I know because when I start answering the first, I'm going to get lost. So I'm writing down the second. How do consumers interact with this? So you have two aspects to your question there. You have this idea of what we call open grazing, which is in complete antithesis. It's a complete objection to the regenerative grazing methodology of mobbing and mowing and moving and tight paddocks and such. And I will tell you right now, absolutely, if you take a domestic cow that is used to being told what to eat, where to be, how to behave, and you give it 100 acres to start grazing, it's not going to make the right decision. In the same sense that if you take a child that's 15 years old, but every single meal of its life was handed to it, it never cooked, it never understood ingredients, it always had McDonald's, Burger King, Taco Bell, or KFC as a choice, and that's the limits of its choices, right? Those are the only choices it made for its own nutritional development over the last 15 years, and then you show it to the great panoply of the life all around it, and you're like, go wild harvest your food. It's going to fail. It's going to kill itself immediately. It's going to pick up a pokeweed leaf 2 weeks after it was edible, and it's going to kill himself on it, right? There's so much nuance and variability that we don't understand that wild animals do, right? The plants that are toxic are not toxic all the time, right? And so you're going to be grazing a plant that's going to kill you, but you're going to graze it in the right season because you have experience, right? So if you take a very domesticated animal like this 15-year-old human being that never had to make a nutritional choice in its life, and it only ever had 4 choices, and you open it up to the great plethora of life around it, it's not going to survive. So what it's going to do is it's going to protect itself. Again, the autonomous acceptance of the basic conditions. It's going to defend itself by only consuming that which it knows. Burger King, McDonald's, Taco Bell, and KFC, the 4 choices, right? And so what it's going to do is it's going to overgraze those plants time and time and time again. And what overgrazing is, to be very clear, and this is nuance that's needed. And I'll be very, very quick because it gets into some science and botany and ecology that we just don't need to have a full grasp of. But it's important to understand topically. So when a plant grows, it grows from crown energy, like a savings account. Okay, so when you look at a plant, it has its leaves, let's say it's grass, and then it has its roots. Now the energy is contained in its roots like a savings account. So when you come in as a cow, you graze that plant and it starts to regrow. It's not regrowing from photosynthesis, right? We all learned in biology class in high school that plants grow from photosynthesis. That's true, but not also really fully true, because when they start to regrow after a cutting, mowing, or grazing event, they're growing from the crown energy. which is last year's or last cycle, growth cycle's photosynthesis. And so it's going to start growing from the crown energy. It's going to grow until it has enough solar panels that it can create all of the energy it needs from direct in the now photosynthesis. And then after it does that for a little bit of time, it's going to be producing too much energy for the energy that it needs because it's now mature. And it's going to take the excess energy it creates from photosynthesis and put it back into its root system to heal its savings account, right? To put money back in the bank. The cow comes in, it grazes it, it starts to regrow. Well, this is a fine thing. We just put money in the bank. Now we're going to be spending money to grow again, right? So this is the cycle of life. We spend the energy in the crown to grow, it grows, we replenish that energy, and we continue through this cycle. Overgrazing is when you defoliate a plant, you graze a plant, you mow the plant, whatever it is, it starts to grow from the crown energy. And before that crown energy can be replenished, you graze it, you mow it again. So when you're driving around a rural landscape and you look around you and you see just really short grass, it's not short because the cows are there eating it. It's short because the cows have historically been there for too long eating it, eating the same plants over and over. And those plants have never, ever, ever had a check deposited, right? They've never had plants that grow tall enough to replenish the crown energy. So they have no energy to regrow. It's not short because it's been grazed. It's short because it has no energy to grow. Okay, and so when you have this very domesticated animal that only knows 4 plants, that's petrified of killing itself because it doesn't know the great panoply of biodiversity all around it, it's going to continually return to those same 4 plants. And as it returns to those same 4 plants, it's going to be overgrazing them. It's going to grow, they're going to eat it, it's going to grow, they're going to eat it, it's going to grow, and then they're going to eat it. And after a certain period of time, those plants are going to disappear. So this is how desertification is. This is how bare soil begets more bare soil. This is how conventional, commercial, industrial agriculture ruins the ecological world. Okay? And so this nuance has to be understood because simply letting your cows out to graze 100 acres is never going to work if they are domesticated. And I'm not saying you have to sell your cows and bring in wild bison or sell your cows and go harvest a couple, caribou and put them in cages and bring them in. And this is why the book matters, the book chronicles our rewilding, our concentric rewilding of these animals through adaptive landscape genomics, through maternal lineages and matriarchies. There's a whole chapter in what's titled phenotypic plasticity. So your phenotype is the observable reality, really, of your epigenetics. This is getting scientific again, I realize, but your epigenetics are the way that your body or your genes interact with the external environment. Your genetics are your genetics. You inherit that. As those genetics play with its internal environment, they become epigenetics. And as those epigenetics create observable physical realities in the body, they become phenotypes. A little bit detailed, but the point is this. Your phenotype's plasticity, okay, so the ability for it to be fluid, to be moldable, to be evolving and adaptive to its local landscape, right? That is this palate feedback loop that connects your palate to your place, right? And so if we can rewild concentrically our domesticated animals to slowly show them, and this is the analogy, I live in Central Virginia. It's about 100 degrees today. It's really hot, 80% humidity. You just sweat to death. If you would take somebody who has a phenotype, okay, an epigenetic based upon genetic expression on an environment that has historically for generations, they've been exposed to 100-degree weather, right? And you tell them to go to the Arctic, right? They're not going to know how to live. They're not going to know, their body is going to start freaking out, right? I mean, you see this all the time. Somebody who lives in a snowy environment is good with snow. Somebody who lives in a southern environment is good with the south. That's our phenotype's plasticity. That's how our body can connect to its natural environment and thrive in its local place. Many of the early European colonists that came to the New World couldn't deal with the humidity and died. Okay, that's your phenotype. Whereas the indigenous peoples here did just fine because their phenotype is adapted to this local land base. Concentric rewilding, that is to say, working with the plasticity of this phenotype of these domesticated animals, is like bringing somebody from Virginia, who's used to 100-degree weather and almost 100% humidity, to the Arctic, but stopping in Ohio first. And then we're going to stop, just south of Lake Erie in Cleveland, right? So we're going from Cincinnati to Cleveland, and then we're going to cross Lake Erie, and we're going to get into Canada. But as we start to work north, I'm going to start giving you access to more clothes. This is a coat. This is a downy coat. This is a winter coat, right? This is a rain jacket. And you're going to start to express that phenotype's plasticity slowly, evolving with that management through generations. So in these chapters in phenotypic plasticity, in the interlinkages chapter where we've been talking about this whole podcast, these things all matter because the 9 months a mammal spends in utero, so inside of its mother's tummy, epigenetically and phenotypically has more of an outcome in that animal's ability to adapt to its external environment than the rest of that animal's life outside of utero. So what that means is that if we are breeding openly, okay, animals on this land that have the ability as mothers to self-select what they need, they're going to be instilling that generational trauma and grief and glitter and joy and everything in between into their offspring. Then if we never separate that offspring from their mother, they're going to continue that educational process. And if we never wean them, that is to say, forcibly remove them from their mothers to break that familial bond, and we never castrate them if they're boys, so they have their entire endocrine and hormone systems working in conjunction with their mother's endocrine and hormonal systems, and that is one family, we have something that we call in the book as an adaptive landscape genomic. That the genomics, the genes, the genome of the land and its animals is working adaptively through generations so that when we're open grazing, right, these animals, they know what to eat. Not just the 4 plants, right, but they know from birth, right? So like our children, I have a 6-year-old, or my wife and I, we have a 6-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 3-year-old. Our 6-year-old, between Imbolc and Samhain every year, so between the beginning of spring and the beginning of the winter season, really, we try to wild forage 1 meal a day. And if we're here, we do it. And sometimes we're not here, we're traveling or something, or we're just really freaking busy. But we try to wild forage or wild harvest 1 meal a day, and it's very possible. There's so much food. You could take 5 steps out of our house and there's a whole meal worth of food. It's not difficult if you know what you're doing, but to know what you're doing, right? And so our 6-year-old is getting better and better at it. Her name is Elowen, and she's very good. She's the leader of it. But our 3-year-old knows just as much as Elowen does, and she's 3. She just turned 3, right? So this is that phenotypic plasticity that exists in generations. And when we go for walks, Elowen, our 6-year-old, who we call Winnie, she'll be like, no, Dad, don't eat that now. That's too bitter right now. Eat it next week. And I'm 31 years old, right? She's 6. And the reason is she was born here. Her phenotype has been plastic and fluid in adapting to the genomics of the landscape since the beginning, right? And so we can't just let go. We have to successively, that is to say, working through succession over generations while keeping families intact, really nurturing the power of the matriarchy, right? So our entire herd is related to a singular matriarch. That takes a lot of time, obviously, and a lot of focus, but she runs the herd and everybody learns from her, and she's the oldest on the landscape, and she is the oldest, and she has great, true matriarchal wisdom that she's instilling in the rest of the herd, and we don't disconnect that wisdom from the rest of the herd by separating or selling or doing other things. And just like Winnie being able to wild forage food better than I can at 6 instead of 31, the animals are successively and progressively adapting their phenotypes to the landscape. And when we got here, there was 5 palatable species of forage 10 years ago. Now there's 175, or I think 173 to be exact, species of forage, and they're all palatable because they're all palatable at different times. The animals have their ability and they understand what they're doing. We own 400 acres, just a little success story. We own 400 acres. We went from 5 species to 173, planting none. This is just natural emergence and communities rising together in this crescendo that I talked about in the beginning. But we bought 12 cows in the beginning. 12 cows on 400 acres of land. It was that degenerated. And now we have hundreds of cows, hundreds of goats, hundreds of sheep. We used to raise hundreds of pigs. We have chickens, and we raise draft horses. We got 7 brood mares, etc. We still have grass out to our eyeballs, and we don't provide anything. I mean, we don't have to provide them minerals to keep them alive, because when they need phosphorus, they understand that pigweed or spiny amaranth or spicy amaranth has phosphorus. So they go out in the landscape and they find pigweed or spicy amaranth, right? When they need calcium, or let's say they may need magnesium, they understand that sawtooth plantain doesn't contain magnesium, but narrowleaf plantain contains magnesium. And they get the magnesium content from narrowleaf plantain. They have this nutritional wisdom, right, that humans are only now relearning. And we're relearning it, in my opinion, because the animals that are domesticated around us, just as we are domesticated, are also relearning it. So the original title of the book was To Run With Them, right? I'm not interested in shipping out the domestics and bringing in the wild. I'm interested in running with them, loosening them, running together, relearning what it means to be an autonomous acceptor of the basic conditions as they are together. And so again, you can't just release control, right? But you have to grow wild together, allowing the phenotypes and the adaptive landscape genomics and the maternal lineages and everything else to speak through generations. That's the attention. People listen to me talk and they listen to the first 5 minutes of an episode and they're like, oh, this guy's just a poet and a philosopher talking about like attention and gifts and things. And it's like, no. Like, read the book and I think you'll see. Listen to the full podcast and you'll understand, or at least hear, regardless if we understand or I speak it well or not, that this philosophy actually has a rooted foundation in the actual world of things. That this is where philosophy, poetry, Shakespeare, and everything else comes together and actually can co-create this more beautiful world. The second aspect of your question, thank God I wrote this down because I would have forgotten. How did the consumer interact with this? I wish that I could tell you that when I wrote this book, everybody was like, yeah, duh, everybody's doing this. Because now this is an easy story to interact with, right? It's not, unfortunately. It's why I wrote the book. So not to, I'm a horrible person to write a book because I'm a horrible person to sell a book. But like, this word has to get spread. Like, that's why the book is written, because there's so much hope that we can release control, do so much less work, which, by the way, equates to a lower costly product, right? If I'm not providing minerals, I'm not providing excess supplementation, I'm not out there every single day spending hours a day moving animals, telling them what to eat, but rather they do the same thing. We got better ecological results. We have more carbon in the soil. We have more soil health, that is to say, more stable soil organic matter and soil carbon mass. That is to say, we're sequestering carbon in the soil. We test this year over year, and it's getting better and better and better. Our biodiversity is raising. The water cycle is increasing. We have springs popping up where springs have never popped up, and we're doing less work. So we have more food for the livestock, and we get to do less work, and we don't have to provide them any food. But I still get to sell it to our local consumer. Granted, I can't do it via field harvesting, but we're working through that because of legalese and everything else. I can now sell it for exponentially cheaper. So the local farmers market here in Charlottesville, Virginia sells grass-fed ground beef, grass-fed and finished ground beef, maybe for $11.50, $12 a pound. And we sell our beef, again, it's USDA processed, like everybody else, because it has to be legally. But we sell our beef for about $6.50 a pound. So for about half the price. And I make more dollars per pound than the other people do. Right. And so we're able to provide it at a much more accessible price for the community that we live in, right, which is a rural, decadent community in Central Virginia where the people that our neighbors and our friends and our community members, they don't have $12 a pound to spend on beef. And so the whole system is working together, and there's community ownership that I'm not talking about here at the Wildland Project, where some of our neighbors own parts of our herd as investments and they get to come and participate in some of the things. Like, it's community instilling nutrients in a system when we learn to just give it our attention. Not to control the shit out of it, right? That's easy. That's what regenerative agriculture is doing in the mainstream, right? And so how do consumers participate in this? Like, find a farmer, like, read the book. I hope that's the case. Read the book. Our marketing team is going to be a little bit angry. Not angry. They're getting through it. But if you go to our website to buy the book and you can't afford the $20 book, it says right underneath of it, just let us know. We'll send you a book. Like, everybody needs to read this. If you have the money to gift to us so we can continue writing and doing these things, please do. But everybody needs to read this book. If we can get this book into a lot of people's hands, and I don't necessarily mean just this book, just the idea of letting go, right, of concentrically rewilding. But to be clear, concentric rewilding is a play on words between kinship and concentric. The word doesn't exist. If you try to type it in, it's going to keep putting a red line underneath of it. It was very annoying writing in Microsoft Word. But it's kinship, right? It's our relations. They're not resources, right? We are a member of Earth. We are an earthling in that sense. It's kinship, but it's also concentric, meaning that it circles and circles and circles upon circles, holes within holes, etc. But that life and its death move in this concentric way, or concentricity, however you want to look at it, yin and yang, left and right brain of the hemisphere, left and right hemisphere of the brain, etc. And so that's what concentric wilding is about. But we have to, as a consumer, start participating in our food system. And whatever I mean, however you want to interpret that is up to you. Whether or not you buy the book and give it to your local farmer and say, please, whether or not you just start actually meeting your local farmers, right? On the previous podcast we did together, I realized that it's not a prescribed next step for people. Like, I wish I could say, there's a supplement that you can buy. It's for sale here. It's $12. You can sign up for, a monthly subscription. It gets sent to you. Like, I wish I could say that. And we do those things. We have subscriptions to things, and it's very helpful. But what I'm saying here is that we as a human race, as Homo sapiens, need to turn inward and start paying attention. Start paying attention to our own families, start paying attention to the life all around us. And that also means starting to form these relationships with the local people, nurturing that life, right? And starting to help them ask questions and starting to have them help us understand what questions to ask them and starting to actually support local farmers doing local good work. Because until these local farmers are supported by their local community to some large degree, I'll say it this way. We have been a local farmer for 15 years. And if I have to spend my time begging the local community to buy my provisions, I also don't get to spend that equal amount of time nurturing the creation of these local provisions, caring for it, attending to their needs, their life, whatever that may be, right? We did a study a couple of years ago. I think we talked about this in the last episode, but the average regenerative local farmer spends 37 hours a week marketing just their provisions. And so if all of their local community would go to that local farmer and say, hey, listen, I want you to take 37 hours a week, dedicate that to concentric rewilding, or dedicate to that to just like going to take a nap for the first time in your life or something like this. Just like take care of yourself, or start hosting an on-farm meal where we can start to commune and converse over a communion of the local foods about these ideas, right? We're going to organize a buying club around you. Your job is done. That would change the local food system overnight. Participation, attention. Attention is a moral act, like we said. If the consumer can just become less of a consumer and more of an attending participant, the world would change. And I realize that's not easy. And I realize it's nuanced. And I realize you could be listening to this, you live in downtown New York City, and you're like, I don't see any farms close to me, right? And so what this means to you in your community is different all over the place. And I can't speak to everyone. But what I can say is there's somebody producing something of nourishing value around you. Right? It could be herbs on a condominium or apartment balcony that you start participating with, right? It could be a hunting club that, you go out to the rural upstate New York landscape, once a year and you start participating with. Like, my point is, it's nuanced, it's complex. There's so many opportunities. I can't speak to all of them, but attending participant in the world around you, be an earthling, realize your humanity, start there, right? And start asking these questions. And maybe the book will help you. Maybe it won't. I hope it does. That's why I wrote it.
I think the book is outstanding, just to be clear. And I haven't even finished it. So, I mean, I'm already kind of stoked about it. I want to tee you up, Daniel, and we've been going for a little while now, but I'm still kind of vibing. I'm hoping that we're all good to go. Maybe we'll get through a few more things here and wrap up. We're not listen, everyone listening. We're not going to make it through the whole book. We're just not going to. We've barely touched it at this point. So, I mean, Daniel has definitely gone through a number of things. A lot of my questions he'll answer just based on his own ability to continue a thought. But I wanted to tee you up on this idea of letting go. Okay. And you had a story that I have not finished yet. This is where I've left off, but around fungi on the roots of trees. But what I wanted to ask, kind of beyond that story, you can tell it if you wish, but also where do we draw the line? So as stewards, this is kind of the question that I had kind of written down as stewards. And you mentioned, hey, go spend time caring for, putting some time towards concentric rewilding, right? And it sounds almost like a contrasting, like almost like they're at odds with one another. Like, where do we draw the line between stewardship and letting go?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's the question that I've wrestled with for the 9 months that this book was being written. It's why in the book I claim that we have to be both hunters and husbandmen. This is in a later section, and so I realize you haven't made it there yet, but I talk about there's a lot of archaeology coming up in front of where you are in the book. Sections 3 start to play with it, and section 4 it's really an exploration of deep history. Because of this, we have this understanding. I think it's a modern understanding that, I mean, it's really an understanding that arises out of this the moment of the Enlightenment in the 16 and 1700s. You have people like Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau and all these people debating about what is a state of enlightenment, etc. And a lot of them are looking back in previous states of humanity, and they see a linear progression from hunter-gatherers through this understanding that we can actually start to become agricultural, and then we can start to see that thought coming through simultaneous to the quelling of the last ice age, right? And so you have the ice receding while agriculture is coming in, and you have this marvelous crescendo in this supposed symphony where the land is becoming habitable again. agriculture is rising, coming in to save the day, and cities are being born. And we leave our idea of hunter-gathering at the city gates. That's the ethos, let alone the history that's being pushed. And it's really born out of the Enlightenment. You don't even have the concept of deep history or prehistory before the Enlightenment, right? Like when Homer was writing the Iliad and the Odyssey, when Homer was talking about Atlantis, which all could have happened prehistory, right? He's not writing, in prehistory. It's just a story. It's just a mythology. It's a story that's been handed down for generations. And maybe that's less true with Homer's writings. I don't know Greek mythology well. You want to talk about, Slovenian, ancient Slav or Celtic mythology, we can have a podcast on that. But my point is, prehistory as an idea was born during the Enlightenment. Okay, and it was a moment when humanity's mind was concentrated on the linear story of progress. Hunter-gatherers, agriculture, cities. That's the progress. Hunter-gatherers gave birth to agriculture, agriculture gave birth to cities. But it's interesting when you look at the anthropologic and archaeological, but even the archaeobotanical, which I don't know if that's a word. Archaeobotany is the word, and I said archaeobotanical, but that's the word I'm going to use. When you look at the archaeology of plants, archaeology of rocks, and archaeology of peoples, you don't see this linear, progressive history. And we look at many different things. In 2013, I wanted to be an archaeologist, and I actually got to work in many of the ancient cave systems in the Dordogne River Valley in the south of France. And I got to do a lot of cave art examinations and explorations and such, like Lascaux and Grand Rock La Cabriels and other things. And so we look at those things because I have personal experience with the cave art of that region and such. But one thing that we can talk about here, and this is all section 4, if you're interested, just keep reading, and it's really interesting, I think. But we'll see if you think so too. The thing that I'll mention here is a study that we have in one chapter about Catalhoyuk. It's an Anatolian city. It's the first moment that the Natufian culture in, I think, modern-day Turkey transitioned from mobile hunter-gatherers to more stable, sedentary hunter-gatherers. And I have to use my words and choose my words very purposefully here because they don't actually turn into agricultural peoples. We see the rise of cities in this region as coexisting to the rise of hunter-gatherers. Okay, but the interesting thing is we don't see agriculture not in the frame. And there's this wonderful shrine. It's called, it'll come to me, the Shrine of Bulls, maybe. It's labeled in section 4 of the book appropriately. But a guy named James Mellart in the 1960s discovered it in Catalhoyuk, in this buried ancient city. It's about 9,000 years old. And there's a shrine, and archaeologically, it's easy to determine that there's this huge foyer that these very tall earthen walls surround. It's like a room. Think of like the Louvre in Paris or something around the Mona Lisa. Like it's a room built to examine something. And on the walls, when you're looking at the pigments, which were collagen-based, which were able to be dated to the exact time that the wall was built, it seems that this entire room, this foyer, this great shrine was built for the art. It wasn't art decorating walls, but walls built for the art to tell a story. And it does tell a story. You see, and I'll skip all the details. It's marvelous. It's 20 pages of a chapter in the book, and so there's a lot of details, but it is marvelous. You have both hunters and husbandmen both depicted. So you have hunter-gatherer peoples and agricultural peoples depicted as coexisting and thriving together in this ancient shrine. Okay, and when you look at the bone DNA and everything else supporting this idea, we never as a species has ever truly seen the world before the Enlightenment as a linear story of progress, but as a nuanced complexity where hunters and husbandmen were really one and the same, right? Agriculture did not rise to save the day, right? Humanity might have arisen to solve a problem of the day through hunting, through gathering, and through agriculture. Even a lot of the indigenous peoples here in the Western Hemisphere, the Shawnee is a great example. They would farm during the summer, that is to say corn and a couple other species. The three sisters, right, that we've all learned about, corn, squash, and
Beans?
Beans, yes ma'am, there you go. And beans, right? So they were agriculture during the summer season when life was aplenty. And then during the winter season, that one camp would break apart into a number of sub-tribes that would all hunt and forage and gather the winter forage around it, where they didn't have to support a singular people, but everybody kind of support a decentralized nodal network, right? And they would become hunters again. So we even see in the modern world, what I am saying is just a couple hundred years ago, but from an indigenous worldview, that the Katol Hoyak Shrine of Bulls, or whatever it is called, from 9,000 years ago is still alive and well. That hunters and husbandmen have always lived together, right? And so keeping that central, we have to approach the modern question, your question, Joey, with that in mind. That is to say that when we think about stewardship, we think about a farmer planting a seed, harvesting that seed, and that's it, right? We don't think of a hunter. And what I'm wanting to challenge you here is to expand our consciousness, our worldview, to see that stewardship is being, it's attention, right? It's participation in the world around us, regardless of how it's done, right? Like the husband that you are, Joey, is different from the husband that I am. And that's a beautiful thing. But for some reason, when it comes down to agriculture, we don't see it with that nuance.
Interesting.
How I'm agricultural here should not be how I'm agricultural in other ways. I mean, even you look at this, from an indigenous perspective, you have the Hopi who live in New Mexico and Arizona, who in their creation story, they're literally told by their creator to find the hardest place in their new world, which is the Western Hemisphere, to inhabit. Because as long as it's hard to inhabit, they're going to have to rely on each other and rely on their God, creator, to supply their needs. That's their creation mythology, right? And then in other peoples, in other areas of the world, right? Still indigenous, still holding Earth's wisdom, right? They're living in an easier place to live because it's easier to hunt and gather and produce agriculture there. Like, for instance, there's a time in the book where we talk about the Ohalo 2 culture, which was only recently discovered in the Jordanian River Valley, of all things, where they found early grain cultivation that dates to 23,000 years ago. Now, regardless if it's 23,000 years ago or 6,000, I don't really care about the date. The point is how that date corresponds to civilized people's emergence. Okay, civilized people, as we understand it in the Enlightenment, this weird moment where we just put into cities and we got away from working in the natural world and such. Really, the modern history of humanity. Point being, the Ohalo 2 culture was cultivating grains about 10,000 years before the rise of agriculture, which should make everybody pause. That doesn't make any sense. Agriculture is the cultivation of grains. So how are we cultivating grains 10,000 years before we started cultivating grains? Now, to put that into even more of an impact, if you think right now as a human being, and you think back to the supposed beginning of agriculture, I need you to double that same time, and we still have grain cultivation in the Jordanian River Valley. And so the point is, we were still hunter-gatherers then. The cultures that existed then in the Jordanian River Valley are also hunter-gatherers. So this idea of stewardship, I would like to transform into kinship, right? I'm not saying that we can't be stewards. And I love in the Bible, Genesis 1:24, I think, it's really where he calls us stewards. And the word is kabash that is used, kabash, had dominion. You have dominion over the earth. And the interesting thing is, and I'm the only one who thinks this, by the way, about 5 years ago, I started studying the ancient biblical Hebrew language, and I got pretty far enough to read it. I can read the Bible in Hebrew and such. I'm not a scholar in any way. And so if you're listening to this and you are a scholar, I mean, oh my God, please contact me. I would love to know this more, but I've never heard anybody talk about this. And so this is an opportunity for somebody to reach out to me, I guess. But the word kabash literally means like a kingly, dominatorial type, like conclusive sort of stewardship. Okay. I think personally, because the word is very rarely used in the rest of the biblical text, especially in the Torah, I think it's talking about consuming. Like when we consume something, it is its final end as that. Okay, because what God is talking about, what God is talking about is nurturing and consumption, right? So like steward the earth, but like I think he's telling us to eat, like be merry, not necessarily to find joy in eating. But the point is, I don't necessarily think what he's saying or what God is saying is always or only to be considered as dominate the earth, control it, get abundance, right? The earth was created for you, right? Because when you actually talk to, some rabbis or Jewish, ancient Jewish scholars and such, it seemingly is very clear that the earth is created for the glory of God. And as long as the earth is created for the glory of God, it's not created for us to have complete dominion over it. That doesn't seem to be its sole purpose. And so there's a point of challenge there to some of this mainstream Bible interpretation, if you will. Not to get lost, because we could easily get lost in this.
I'm
You have a
loving
whole
this.
podcast.
No, I'm in. Yeah.
Okay.
This was going to be actually one of my questions, because I constantly come back to aren't we supposed to be stewards of the earth? Like, aren't, because we're
I was leaning that way too. So
yeah. And so this question of like, well, that's our calling. Like, humans were created and we are in partnership with
shepherds.
with
I mean,
God's
there's so many things,
plan. Yeah. But
Right.
I think this is an interesting concept you bring up, is like, well, maybe we have confused, not saying that those things aren't true, not saying that we aren't also made in his image, but maybe
Exactly.
we've confused what it means to be a shepherd or a steward. And I'm constantly in my head during this conversation thinking, is it the Maasai? There these pastoral cultures that some still exist today, where they didn't call themselves hunter-gatherer. They were called pastoral cultures, and they would move with these herds of animals and from them collect their milk and their blood and occasionally their meat. They would follow them with the animal's migration pattern.
Right.
And that obviously doesn't work if you're settled in a city. But it brings me back to this conversation of like, well, we weren't just hunter-gatherer or agriculturalists. We coexist, or in some seasons we play one role and then we move to another role. And I think that I've never heard explained until this show. So I appreciate that perspective, because we want to put everything in a cute little box. That is the essence of the American food industry.
Right.
We want to put it in a box and we want to sell it to you. We want to explain it to you. We want you to buy it, and we want you to not really ask questions. And you are the opposite of that.
Yeah. I'm
You ask all
arguing
the
for
questions.
nuance.
Yes.
You're exactly right. I believe we are stewards. I really do. I believe we were created in the image of God. Like I said earlier, to have hope is to believe that Creator created you, or God created you, and He has a plan for you. Right? Like that's how to have hope. Right? That's the very definition of the hope that I hold on to, is that Creator has created me for a purpose. It might not even have that purpose to be an end or an outcome that I enjoy. Right? I mean, that's to some degree sainthood. Like, I don't to get lost in like orthodoxy and like particulars of religion, but to a large degree, we're very comfortable with that from a religious perspective. We're less comfortable with that from a cultural or societal perspective. And what I'm arguing for, or really starting to question or ask or inquire, is why. We have to open up this concept of being a steward to being a participant, a lover, a gifter, right, of earth, the created earth all around us. That is beauty. And so in the book, it's interesting. One of the other things, before we got on this podcast and recording, I talked to you about the publishing journey that I had with this book. And I won't relive the thoughts with you now, but I will tell you one of the largest arguments that both agents and publishers alike, like the top literary agent in the United Kingdom, was very interested in this book. Publishes all of the other books in this genre that you would recognize. Like you were talking about fungi that I realized, Joey, we got away from, but she, publishes a lot of books that you would read in regard to fungi and tree communication and other things. And she was very interested in the book, but she says, Daniel, you have to take out your critiques of civilization from the book. You're talking about concentric rewilding. I don't know why we're talking about how modern civilization in its linear worldview has to end in order for this more concentric worldview to be born. This is not a cultural critique book. And I said, well, listen, it is impossible to erupt into a new paradigm, which is a very old paradigm, a concentric or kinship-based, relational, more indigenous, ancient paradigm, if we still have the paradigm of the modern civilized world, what I call the industrial paradigm, or the industrial mindset. And in the past, I've said mother culture. However you want to describe it, you can't maintain your current view of life while also allowing this new life to be born, right? I mean, we see this in religion, in Christianity, and many other things. Like, we have to be reborn, and you have to let the old die. Like, again, we're okay with this in religion. We're not okay with this in societal and cultural evolution. And so what I'm asking is to pair these two narratives together. Not necessarily that they have to become religious, but just that we have to extend our religious understanding, which is one part of our body, to start to accentuate and discuss and force an evolution of the other part of our body, which is social and cultural, among other things. But like, I have this quote here that I'll read, but like this quote, people stumble over it. And I realize, but it's on page 153 of the book. I just have it pulled up in the digital ebook here for ease. But it says, at the iron gates of the Colosseum, to the red-stained and marble halls of American empire, to the incineration chambers of fascist racism, to the Spanish Inquisition, or the burnt streets of Salem, we have no choice but to abandon the hope that civilization is the underwriter and patron saint of progress and morality. You see, we have to start to challenge the worldviews implicit, or really the realities implicit in our civilized worldview. Not that we have to become uncivilized. I never say this in the book. But what I'm saying is, if you believe, and this is the industrial post-enlightenment worldview that demands property rights, that demands ownership of the land, it demands many different things, including colonization, another topic for maybe another day, but it demands these things. We have to let that pass if we are to become reawakened to the ancient understanding that we are Homo sapiens, a member of Earth, an important member, just like everybody else, created for a particular reason by God, by Creator, to do a particular thing. And what that means to you is different from what it means to me. And if we can start allowing that nuance to reign, we at least will be better off. Where it goes, I don't know, right? I have no understanding of the outcome. I hope the outcome starts to look a little bit like it used to look a long time ago, maybe pre-enlightenment, or maybe back in the Catalhoic age, where hunters and husbandmen ran as one group, right, of co-creators, for Earth's gifts and more. But it's going to have to look differently. And so there's a lot of cultural commentary in the book in order to facilitate this enhanced understanding that we cannot continue with the same worldview and expect a different outcome. The last podcast you and I did, I said it differently. At least I would believe I said it differently. I haven't listened to it in a while since it came out last year. But generally around that time, I was saying that regenerative agriculture is industrial agriculture rebranded. And what I'm saying here is that we cannot keep rebranding our same worldview and expect a new result. It's why a lot of regenerative farms are still struggling. It's why a lot of regenerative farms still struggle to exist from a financial, ecological, or physical perspective. It's why a lot of regenerative farms are farming themselves to death, right? Because I say in the book that regenerative agriculture, it takes industrial capitalism for granted and Earth as a resource as a guarantee, right? Earth is going to get better because we need it to get better. But realize that Earth is still in it. No. Earth is going to get better when she wants to get better. Just like a cow is going to graze better when it can graze better, right? If this life is autonomous and we're autonomously accepting the basic conditions as they are, Earth needs to be animate. That is to say, climate. Let's use that for now. The climate has to be animate, like the air, like the water, like the trees, like the grass is animate. What I mean by that is it has the ability to make decisions. Like you were saying, Joey, in section 2, talking about the fungal distribution of nutrients, right? Dr. Simard, Simard. There it is. I found it. Dr. Simard, let's call her that, has written a marvelous book, Finding the Mother Tree, where about 40 years of her, doctoral and scientific research has demonstrated that trees are feeding other trees through their own photosynthetic processes. And so, for instance, she did a study between American beech, I think, or maybe birch, and a Douglas fir tree. And what they did was they put a shade cloth over, so they completely limited the photosynthetic ability of the Douglas fir. They put a shade cloth over the Douglas fir, expecting the Douglas fir to die. But they planted, I think, an American beech or a paper birch tree. I don't recall which one, but another tree next to it. And then came back, and they noticed that the Douglas fir was still living. And they started studying the nutrient profiles, that is to say, the photosynthetic or supposed photosynthetic activity of the Douglas fir tree, which should be nothing. It should be null. It has zero sunlight access. And it was as if the fir was in complete solar exposure. And so they started studying it. And 40 years later, or 30 years later, whatever it was, she wrote a book and she proved or demonstrated time and time again, science doesn't prove much, but it can demonstrate a lot, that the one tree that was photosynthetically active, let's call it the American beech, had been passing nutrients produced from its own photosynthetic activity to the birch tree. The Douglas fir tree. And so these trees are communicating back and forth. This is not competition. But if a tree is completely unable to produce energy by itself photosynthetically, other trees are going to help it, right? And so as this community co-evolves, that is to say, co-inhabits the place around it in some sort of collective collective self-understanding, but self-organization as well, you start to see that life is not competition, but collaboration. That's really what her book is about. And as we extend that, because that's interesting, it's interesting that mycorrhizae fungi, a particular type of fungi, is facilitating this energy transference in the root systems between hardwoods, the American beech, and the more coniferous Douglas fir. It's really interesting. But as we expand that out into the whole realm of earthen activity, we start to realize that cows, the popular phrase, it's not the cow, it's the how. But cows are destroying the planet. But if we start to manage them better, i.e., if we humans tell a cow how to be a better cow, it's not a bad cow anymore because we humans told them how to be better cows. We start to realize that if life is really in this co-creative convergence of self-understanding and self-organization, self-knowledge between these two different types trading energy through, fungal activity, what are we missing between humanity and the cows? Because we're forcing them to graze in particular ways because we see it as natural. But as section 4 of the book really tries to expose, question, bring up the idea of questioning, it doesn't say anything definitive, of course, because nobody was there 500 years ago. We don't have this understanding. But what if cows don't mob, mow, and move all the time historically? What if a cow really just needs a human to not be some industrial, modern, agricultural, mover of polywire and electric fencing, but something else entirely? Like, what if the cow is waiting for a human to walk into a field with a long-range rifle or a recurve or longbow, right? And just to be that hunter again? What if the whole of creation erupts when humanity realizes that we are created in the image of God to do something that we're not currently doing? These are questions, right, that the book is going to raise. I have no answer for them because you have the answer. When you start to question it, it's your own understanding of the thing. It's not relative truth. Truth is absolute, but our understanding of the role that Creator has given to us is relative to you. That's what I'm saying. And so cultural critique has to be a part of it. Ecological critique has to be a part of it, but it's generally the reconstruction, or I would like to say the reawakening of this understanding that to be a steward is not to linearize to control, as we said in the beginning, that industrial systems do. It's not to diversify to control, as a lot of regenerative systems do, but is to let go slowly, run with them, rewild together, and then in that understand what your role is to be. Because today you could you can play some arguments against this project here, but we produce more food than we ever have. We produce more solar exposed photosynthetic activity than we've ever have. We have, I don't know how many fives go in 175. We have that many times more plants vegetating, right? We have more community ownership. So we own less of this landscape today than we ever have. We have more nutrient-rich beef than we ever have. I mean, we have more community happiness and acceptance of our work, right? Because a lot of regenerative farms are outcasts in their communities because they're the only ones doing it right, and everybody else is a bad guy. And so all of the things we can talk about is only increasing when we let go, as if Creator and God only decided it to be that way from the beginning. And all we've done in some large degree is get in the way. Not that we've done it bad our whole lives, but that at this moment when we start to question what humanity truly is, and we focus on awareness and attention and participation, that we could reawaken this opportunity that is currently not available to us. Because at the end of the day, and at the end of the book, it gets to this, and I'll conclude here. But at the end of the day, let's use the climate narrative as an example. You could use health as another example. I'll use the climate crisis as my example. Right now, let's say we have a climate crisis. Let's say we only have 60 harvests left in the conventional system before there's no food. If we were to rise up as a regenerative people and build soil organic matter and sequester the carbon and reduce the greenhouse gas in our atmospheres and lower the climate, and it turns it from a crisis into not a crisis, we are still going to have all of the systems, all of the worldviews, all of the practices that got us there originally. And the soil is going to have to rise up again and again and again to save us. We still have all of the systems that brought us into this mess perfectly viable. All we've done is just force Earth to be a little bit more healthy, mitigate the negative aspects of our current industrial system that, just a couple months ago, our neighbor just deforested 2,500 acres of old growth forest. It took them 3 weeks. The modern industrial machine-based ability of humankind to destroy Earth is so freaking fast. 2,500 acres, 3 weeks. I've been here for 10 years. We have 400 acres. We're never going to compete. It's taken me 10 years, right, to get this place to, a moderate state of regeneration. And I say these words on purpose because a lot of our journey, as the book contends, the book is a transition from where we are to where we are, where we were to where we are today. So a lot of our journey is this control-based regenerative agriculture. It took us 10 years via controlling the outcomes to some large degree, maybe 4 years and then 7 years of transition. But the point is 10 years of moderate control, and we're still only 400 acres. And in a matter of 3 weeks, we can deforest 2,500 acres. Right. And so what we have to start to realize is that no matter how much carbon we sequester or soil we build in our little regenerative farms, we have a systemic, cultural, societal, spiritual issue where humanity is raping and pillaging and eroding mountains faster than we can ever heal them. It's not a point on soil health. Soil health matters, yes. But we have to start looking at the deeper things, which I realize the book only starts to touch on. Hopefully future books can dive a little bit more into that once the story has been set.
Wow. So good. It feels like a good place to wrap it up, Daniel. We could probably keep talking. We could probably get into some, exegetical, disputes if we wanted to. But let's wrap it up there. I'm super thrilled to have had you on, and can it give people an overview of where they can find you, where they can find your book, and yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. No, this has been wonderful. You can find me. I have so many random touch points, but if you just go to our main website, wildtimschul.com, which I'm sure you can put in the show notes, it has, you can get the book, you can learn about us. There's plenty of videos. You can get access to our online community where all these thoughts are being discussed and written about, and all sorts of fun things, online cohorts and webinars and everything in between. And so wildtimschul.com is a marvelous place to start.
Beautiful.
Right on. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we kind of just touched into Stagtine and all the thoughts that come with that, with Daniel Firth Griffith. And go check that out. Go find that book. And Daniel, thanks for coming on, man. Thanks for coming back and talking with us and putting up with all of our, kind of estranged questions. And so look forward to hearing and seeing you in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. A blessing and an honor, really. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. And with that, Daniel Firth Griffith has left the virtual chat.
Fun fact, his real name is Firth, but his parents called him Daniel. And I really like the name Firth. I've just never heard that before. Yeah. I think that's so cool. That's very why unique. On his books, it's D. Firth Griffith, in case you're wondering. But we did talk to him about what we should call him on the show, just so y'all are aware, we care about it. Anyways, fun fact. Okay, so we don't always do 2-hour episodes, but when you have conversations that require a lot of unpacking because the concepts are very large, then we leave space for that. And I think that it's been a long time since we released a show.
Thanks for hanging with us, friends. We even actually post-interview continued to discuss family lineage within agriculture and the importance of that.
Yeah, that concept was new to me, and it's something I'm going to keep thinking about because it makes sense, and I've never heard anyone talk about it. It's almost like the way your food is raised is important, but the way they're killed is maybe even more important. And also the family lineage of the animals is what lets the animals kind of self-manage because they're passing on generational information versus you having to constantly be their caretaker and steward them in a much more hands-on way by Daniel taking himself out of the equation and leaving the mother and the grandmother in with leaving the herd intact. He can do less work and have better output.
Fascinating. Very interesting concept. Love getting him on the show, and we'll probably have him on again, is my guess, because it sounds like homie has other books kind of rolling out here soon. Definitely go get it.
He does.
I do enjoy it. I have not finished it yet. I will be finishing it probably soon. But yeah, if you're watching, this is what it looks like. Stagtine by D. Firth Griffith, and he said his website, and check it out, find it, get that book. And it's the kind of book I would say that if you're near a creek and you're alone and it's quiet, this is like the perfect book, right? like on a subway going downtown, it would be a stranger read.
Mm-hmm.
Still good.
You need some focus.
It's not even just about focus. It's about it's a bit of an experience.
Okay.
It's a bit of an experience. I think it could be the experience could be weakened if it were read somewhere that was not potentially also adding to that experience.
I see.
Because it's just very, yeah, it's good. It's a good book. I recommend. I like it. If you wanted to hear us talk more because you didn't hear enough, you could find us on Instagram. You could listen to other episodes. We did another one with Daniel. You could go find more of him talking.
I believe it's titled something like "You're Eating Diabetic Cows" or something or other.
Anyhow, go check that out. It's down there somewhere. So just keep scrolling.
You can use the search function.
You could use the search function.
Mm-hmm.
You can leave us a review if you liked this and you like other episodes that we've done. Let us know. Give us that 5-star review. Help push this to find and reach more people so that we can continue to kind of get the message out there. We like that. Other people like that. That's good. It's good for everybody. Good for us. Good for you. You could support yourself by going and finding free resources that we've created to help educate you and others on homegrowneducation.org. We have a raw dairy guide teaching you about raw dairy and a sourdough guide teach you how to get into the sourdough game.
Mm-hmm.
We also have some paid resources on there that are also for you and for your kids. You can find those meal plans and curriculum. Homegrowneducation.org. Go get those books. Keep the education and the pursuit of food freedom on this real food journey happening. We also have a products and goods business called hazelmeyergoods.com, shopth.com. Go on there for your coffee, your tea, lard dish soap, dish brushes, sourdough tools, proofing baskets. Such awesome things for your house. Go check it out, shopth.com. And you can find us on Instagram. I'm at Joey Hazelmeyer. Elizabeth is at Liz Hazelmeyer and at homegrown_education. And until next time, that's a wrap.